Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Beneath the Pines of Blackwood Hollow. The drive to Redwood National Park had been uneventful, the kind of quiet that settles over long stretches of highway flanked by endless trees. I remember watching the shadows lengthen as the sun dipped behind the ridges, the way the fading light made the forest look both inviting and unknowable. I had been eager to escape the city, to step away from the noise of work and the hum of everyday life. It felt like the right decision at the time, even if I hadn't fully understood what I was stepping into. I arrived at the campground just before dusk. The air was crisp, carrying a faint scent of pine and damp earth that smelled cleaner than anything I'd breathed in months. The ranger station was quiet, a small wooden building with peeling paint and a single flickering lantern hanging by the door. I signed in, noting the usual warnings about wildlife and unpredictable weather, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The woman behind the counter handed me a map and pointed me towards Site 12, near the edge of the park where the trees grew thickest. Setting up my tent in the fading light, I kept glancing toward the towering redwoods, their trunks like ancient sentinels standing guard over the forest floor. The breeze whispered through the branches, and somewhere a bird called out a sharp, lonely sound that echoed through the trees. I told myself it was just the park settling into night, that these were the sounds of nature and nothing more. After I'd finished pitching the tent, I started a small fire in the pit provided. Flames licked at the dry wood, casting warm orange light onto the surrounding trees. I roasted some marshmallows, the way I used to do as a kid, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, but a tightness, like something was watching just beyond the circle of light. The campground was nearly deserted. I saw a few other tents scattered in the distance, but no sign of other campers. The ranger had mentioned the park wasn't busy this time of year, and the quiet was almost total except for the occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the brush. I told myself to relax. I was alone here, but not isolated. Right? I crawled into my sleeping bag earlier than I'd planned, hoping the dark wouldn't play tricks on my mind. The forest was alive with sounds, the creaking of branches, the distant howl of a coyote, the low hum of insects. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but the rustling outside my tent made me freeze several times. Each time I thought I'd heard a footstep or the brush shifting closer, the noise stopped. Around midnight, the wind picked up, rattling the tent poles and making the trees groan. I unzipped the flap to check outside. The air was cold and sharp, the forest cloaked in darkness but for the pale light of the moon filtering through the canopy. That's when I noticed it, something off about the woods beyond the firelight's reach. The shadows seemed thicker, denser, like the darkness itself had weight and shape. I swallowed hard and zipped up the tent again, telling myself it was just my imagination. But sleep refused to come. Instead, I lay there, listening. At some point, I heard a faint scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging across bark. It didn't last long, but it was close enough to make my skin prickle. Quiet followed, then the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I thought about calling the ranger, but my phone had no signal here, buried under layers of trees and hills. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to settle, convincing myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the edge of the forest. Something waiting. When dawn finally came, it was a relief. The first pale light revealed nothing unusual, just the familiar shapes of trees, the soft moss underfoot, and the scattered remnants of last night's fire. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the campsite behind. As I hiked down the trail toward the park's entrance, I noticed something high on the ground near where my tent had stood, a series of small, shallow grooves scratched into the dirt. They didn't look like animal tracks, not quite. The marks were irregular, jagged, almost deliberate. I knelt to examine them closer, but before I could make sense of the pattern, a sudden rustle in the brush startled me upright. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a dark figure slipping between the trees. My heart pounded, and I scanned the forest, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent again, save for the distant call of a crow. I told myself I was imagining things, but the unease had rooted itself deep. That night, I stayed in the park's small visitor cabin, a cramped structure with thin walls and a single flickering bulb overhead. I locked the door and sat by the window, watching the forest beyond. The shadows seemed thicker still, as if the trees had drawn closer, waiting. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scratching, the soft footsteps, the whisper of leaves. At one point, I thought I saw a face, or something like a face, pressing against the glass, pale and blurred. When I blinked, it was gone. I'm not sure what I expected when I came here, to this park that promised solitude and nature's peace. Instead, I found something else, something ancient, silent, and waiting just beyond the edge of the trees. The woods are still out there, dark and patient, and I can't stop wondering what I might have disturbed. Tomorrow, I plan to leave. But part of me is afraid the forest won't let me go that easily. The sun had barely begun its descent when I decided to press on, leaving behind the faint glow of the ranger station. It felt wrong to stop now, even though every muscle in my body begged for rest. The path ahead was rumored to be the most isolated stretch of the park, and that was precisely why I needed to see it for myself. I told myself the stories were exaggerations, the kind of folklore people spread around campfires to scare tourists. Yet the silence that enveloped the forest was thick and oppressive, as if each tree was holding its breath. I moved slowly, boots crunching on the brittle underbrush, every snap and rustle amplified in the growing dusk. The trail twisted between gnarled pines whose trunks were scarred by time and weather, their branches clawing skyward like desperate fingers. The air was colder here, heavier, and carried a faint, sour scent that I couldn't place. I paused, listening. The usual chorus of birdsong and insect hum was absent. Not even the wind stirred the leaves. A knot of unease settled in my stomach. I tried to shake it off, blaming the fatigue and the creeping shadows for twisting my senses. I told myself I was imagining things. Still, I caught sight of something moving just beyond the edge of the path, something that vanished the moment I turned my head. I quickened my pace, heart thudding loudly in my ears. The path narrowed, flanked by dense thickets that seemed to lean closer as I passed. I was suddenly very aware of how exposed I was, how easy it would be for someone or something to slip out unnoticed. The daylight was fading fast now, the world reduced to muted grays and blacks. Then I saw it, a small clearing ahead, illuminated by a shaft of fading sunlight. Relief flooded me, and I stepped into the open space, eager for a breath of fresh air and a moment to collect myself. The clearing was oddly quiet, but not in the way the forest had been. Here, the silence was thick with something else, something unnatural. At the center stood a weathered stone marker, half buried in moss and earth. I approached it cautiously, brushing away years of detritus. The inscription was worn but still legible, "Remember the lost." I stared at the words, an inexplicable chill creeping up my spine. Lost? The idea had been gnawing at me since I'd arrived. People had disappeared in this park before, hikers who vanished without a trace, their campsites abandoned, their belongings left untouched. But those were stories, I told myself. Tragic accidents, bad luck. Nothing supernatural. Still, the marker seemed deliberate, a warning or a memorial. I glanced around, suddenly feeling very small and exposed in the vast wilderness. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves, but shaped oddly, almost like voices just beyond comprehension. I spun around, eyes darting through the trees. Nothing. The forest held its silence once more, indifferent and unmoving. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was the wind, my mind playing tricks. But deep down, a seed of fear had been planted. I decided to turn back, to reach the ranger station before nightfall. I could navigate the trail in the dark, I'd done it before. But when I retraced my steps, the forest seemed different. The path was less clear, covered in fallen branches and debris. I stopped to check the trail markers, but the painted blazes were faded, their visibility compromised by moss and age. Unease blossomed into dread. I realized I wasn't as certain of my direction as I thought. The trees around me looked unfamiliar, and the trail seemed to be twisting in ways it hadn't before. I tried to recall landmarks but came up with nothing. A prickling sensation ran across my skin. I was lost. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. I pulled out my phone to check for signal. Nothing. No bars. Of course. I'd heard before that deep in the park, cellular service was non-existent. The sun slipped below the horizon, the last light draining from the sky. Darkness gathered quickly, swallowing the forest whole. The chill deepened, seeping into my bones. I forced myself forward, keeping my hands on the trees as tactile guides, marking my path. But as I moved, the whispering returned. This time, unmistakably voices, low and fragmented, as if tarried on the wind from far away. I strained to understand, but the words dissolved before my mind could grasp them. Fear pressed in. I called out, my voice cracking. Hello? Is anyone there? No answer, only the whispering and the rustle of leaves. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree. In the dim light of my phone's flashlight, I noticed something strange, footprints near the edge of the clearing, shallow and erratic. They weren't human, not fully. The prints had too many toes, and the spacing was off. My skin crawled. I debated whether to follow the tracks or keep moving in what I hoped was the right direction. The rational part of me argued to stay on the trail, but the primal urge to understand what I was seeing gnawed at me. As I leaned closer to inspect the prints, a sharp sound cracked through the forest, the snap of a branch underfoot. I spun around, flashlight darting through the darkness. Nothing. But this time, I knew something was out there, watching. The whispering stopped abruptly. Silence. I backed away from the clearing, heart hammering. Then a low growl, almost inaudible, echoed from deep within the woods. I froze, every instinct screaming to run. But I was still lost, and running blindly in the dark felt worse. I forced myself to move, head down, searching for any sign of the path. The forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning over me like sentries. I heard footsteps behind me, soft, pacing, matching my own. I dared to glance back. Nothing visible, just shadows shifting between the trunks. The feeling of being hunted settled over me like a shroud. I broke into a cautious run, branches scraping my arms, roots threatening to trip me. The sounds behind me quickened, the footsteps now deliberate and heavy. My lungs burned, but I pushed onward, desperate. Suddenly, the path forked. I stopped short, panting, unsure which way to go. The air grew colder, the fog thickening at my feet. From the left, the whispering returned, clearer now, beckoning. From the right, silence. I hesitated. Then a voice, low and breathy, pierced the night. This way. It was human, unmistakably so. I swallowed my fear and turned toward the voice, stepping into the mist. The forest swallowed me whole. I woke to the dull, persistent thrum of rain against the canvas of my tent. The morning was gray, the kind of heavy, leaden sky that seemed to press down on the forest, muffling sounds and casting everything in a washed-out hue. The storm hadn't relented during the night, and the scent of wet earth and pine filled the air. I lay there for a moment, reluctant to move, listening. Outside, the forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just the steady patter of rain and the occasional creak of sodden branches. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I'd been alone in the wilderness before, and rainstorms weren't unusual in this part of the park. But there had been something in the air since yesterday, something that made the hairs on my neck stand up and my stomach tighten. The feeling that I was being watched. Not by some animal, but by something else. Something not quite natural. I forced myself to unzip the tent and step out, pulling the hood of my rain jacket over my head. The forest looked different in the rain, the colors deepened and the shadows thickened. The trail I'd been following yesterday was muddy and slick, puddles dotting the uneven ground. I hadn't moved far from my original campsite, and the map in my pack confirmed I was still within the boundaries of the designated hiking area. But the signs that had been there yesterday, the painted markers on trees, were gone. At least, I couldn't find any. I crouched to inspect the mud on the trail. There were footprints, but they weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, like someone heavier had passed through here recently. The shape was odd, almost like a boot with a thick sole, but the pattern was irregular, as if the tread was worn or damaged. I wrapped my fingers around a wet root and stood, heart pounding. Why hadn't I noticed footprints yesterday? I decided to follow them. Partly out of curiosity, partly because I felt a rising panic at the thought of being lost or trapped in this endless, sodden forest. The tracks led away from the main trail, veering into a dense thicket of spruce and fir. The rain was lighter now, almost a mist. I pressed on, the undergrowth scratching in my jacket and soaking through my gloves. After 20 minutes, the footprints ended. I stood in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, their trunks blackened by moisture. The ground was littered with broken branches and flattened patches of moss. Something had been here recently. I scanned the area and caught sight of a piece of faded fabric caught on a low branch. It was dark green, maybe from a jacket or a bag. I tugged it free. It smelled damp and faintly metallic. Blood? I wasn't sure. My pulse quickened. I wanted to turn back, but a strange compulsion kept me rooted. Then, I noticed something else, a small, roughly carved wooden figure lying half buried in the mud nearby. It was crudely made, about the size of my fist, and looked like a twisted human form with exaggerated eyes. The wood was weathered, darkened by rain, but I could make out faint symbols etched into its surface. I slipped the figure into my pocket and started back toward my tent. The wind had picked up, whistling through the branches and tugging at the rain flaps of my jacket. As I walked, an unsettling thought crept in. This was a national park, a place people came to enjoy nature and escape civilization. Yet here, miles from the nearest ranger station or other hikers, was a silence that felt deliberate, oppressive. Back at my campsite, I set my pack down and tried to focus on practical matters. My phone had no signal, as expected. I told someone my route before I left, but no one would check in for a couple of days. The storm was forecast to last through the weekend. I ate a cold granola bar, glancing nervously at the tree line. The forest seemed to lean closer now, shadows pooling like ink. I pulled out the wooden figure, turning it over in my hands. The symbols were strange, almost tribal, but I couldn't place their origin. They didn't look like anything from the park's interpretive guides or the local indigenous artwork I'd seen in the visitor center. This felt different, more primal. Night began to fall, and the rain tapered off to a drizzle. I lit a small campfire, the flames flickering weakly against the damp wood. The forest around me was still, but I thought I heard something movement just beyond the firelight. A crack of snapping twig, a rustle in the underbrush. I froze, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing moved. I forced myself to lie down, pulling my jacket tight around me, eyes wide open. The fire sputtered, throwing long shadows into the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its call unnervingly close. A low groan echoed through the forest, almost human but twisted, unnatural. I swallowed hard, heart pounding. Sleep didn't come, and when it did, it was restless and filled with images I couldn't explain, twisted trees reaching out like hands, eyes glowing in the dark, whispers just beyond comprehension. I woke hours later, shivering despite the night's mild temperature. In the faint light of dawn, I packed up quickly, driven by a sudden, desperate need to leave. The trail was muddy and slick, and I slipped a couple of times, cursing under my breath. As I moved, I noticed the absence of birds again. The forest was dead silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. Then I saw them. Figures between the trees. Not more than 10 yards away, standing absolutely still, watching. They were tall, thin, their shapes blurred by the morning mist. I blinked, and they were gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination playing games after a night of poor rest. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Something was out here with me, something that didn't belong. I broke into a run, the trail slick beneath my boots. I didn't stop until I reached a ranger station parking lot hours later, mud-caked and soaked to the bone. The place was deserted. No cars, no staff. Just the faint echo of the forest beyond. I called out but heard only silence. The door to the station was locked, windows dark. My phone finally caught a weak signal, and I sent a text to my emergency contact, telling them I was safe and on my way back. But as I waited, pacing the empty lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind in the forest. Something that had followed me all this way. And that, somehow, the park wasn't done with me yet. I woke to the sharp crack of a branch snapping just beyond the edge of my tent. For a moment, I thought it might have been the wind, but the air had been dead still all night. The forest was suffocatingly silent after that, a silence so dense it seemed to press against my eardrums. My heart thudded louder than the quiet, the rhythm of fear steady and relentless. I lay awake, eyes wide in the dark. The beam from my flashlight, sitting inactive on the ground outside, cast a faint glow that barely penetrated the thick canopy overhead. Somewhere, a bird called out a sharp, unnatural cry that didn't belong to any songbird I'd heard before. It felt wrong, almost mocking. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a tired mind imagining threats. I had been hiking alone for days, and the isolation played tricks on me, fraying the edges of my reason. But the sharp snap wasn't the first sign that something was off. Not by a long shot. Earlier that afternoon, while navigating a narrow ridge, I had seen something moving in the distance. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the way it disappeared behind the trees, too quickly, too deliberately, didn't feel natural. Then there was the strange pattern of broken branches and trodden leaves that didn't match any animal trail I'd encountered before. It was as if someone or something had been following me, just out of sight. The park rangers I spoke to last week had warned me about the remoteness of this part of the forest, but I brushed off their vague cautions. The national park was vast, wild, and mostly untouched. My plan had been to document the rare flora and fauna, capture footage of the landscape the way no other amateur had before. But now, as the night deepened, I realized how naive I'd been. The tent fabric rustled slightly, and I froze. My fingers crawled to the zipper, but I forced myself to stay still. There was no logical reason for someone to be out here at this hour, not a hiker or hunter given the park's strict regulations. My breath caught, and I strained to hear more, but it was just the wind again, or maybe not. I debated whether to grab my flashlight and investigate, but the thought of stepping into the dark, uncharted wilderness without any sense of what was lurking chilled me to the bone. I had brought a small bear spray for emergencies, but I hated the idea of using it without knowing what I was up against. Time passed agonizingly slowly. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of underbrush sounded like a threat. I counted the minutes, convincing myself to wait until dawn, when I could see clearly and hopefully find a way out. Finally, the first pale light of morning filtered through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. My eyes swept the perimeter, searching for signs of whatever had been out there. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves and broken twigs, but nothing unusual stood out at first glance. Then I saw it, a faint trail of footprints pressed into the damp earth, large and irregular, unlike any animal tracks I knew. They led away from my sight, deeper into the woods. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me sleep. I shoved my gear into my backpack and started after the trail, heart pounding with every step. The forest closed in around me, the path narrowing and twisting through dense undergrowth. Every shadow seemed to move with malevolent intent, every gust of wind carrying whispers I couldn't decipher. After nearly an hour, the trail ended abruptly at a small clearing. The sight stopped me cold. In the center lay a crude arrangement of stones, circling a spot where the grass was flattened and darkened like a fire pit but with no signs of recent use. Around it, strange symbols were carved into nearby trees, deep grooves forming patterns that made my skin crawl. I knelt closer to inspect them, tracing the rough shapes with trembling fingers. They weren't any language I recognized, but they felt ancient, something primal and deliberately threatening. A sudden crack from behind spun me around, and I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, a shadow slipping away too quickly to follow. Panic surged through me. I knew I had to get out. Turning back, I hurried down the path, senses sharpened to every sound, every flicker of motion. The forest seemed alive now, watching, waiting. At one point, I stumbled over a root and fell hard, scraping my hands and knees. As I scrambled up, I looked back and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, unnervingly still, blending with the trees. Our eyes met for a moment, and I felt an overwhelming coldness radiate from it. Then it vanished. I ran without looking back, pushing my legs to their limits, heart slamming against my ribs. The path twisted and turned, and I lost my bearings more than once. I thought I was going in circles, trapped in a maze of wilderness. When I finally broke through the last stand of trees and saw the parking lot where I'd left my car, relief washed over me like a wave. But I didn't stop. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. Driving down the winding road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Nothing followed, no headlights, no shadows. Just the empty road stretching behind me. But the feeling that I wasn't truly alone stayed with me long after I left the park behind. Something had been out there, and it wasn't just the wild. Whatever it was, it had watched me and still did, waiting in the dark. By the time I reached the edge of the clearing, the sun had already dipped below the line of pines. The forest's shadows deepened, swallowing the familiar shapes I'd counted on just hours before. My legs ached, and every snap of a twig or distant rustle sent a fresh wave of tension through my chest. I had lost track of how long I'd been moving through this godforsaken section of the park, but I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer just lost. Something else was here, waiting. I cast a glance behind me, half expecting to see the flicker of a light or a pair of eyes watching from the darkness. But there was nothing. Just trees, indifferent and still. I tried to steady my breathing, slow the pounding of my heart. The whispering winds played tricks on my ears, and I swore I heard footsteps mimicking my own, always just out of sight. Earlier that day, The ranger had told me about this section, a less traveled part of the park, known for its dense underbrush and eerie silence. I'd laughed it off then, thinking the man was just trying to scare a city kid like me. Now, feeling the weight of the forest all around, I understood what he meant. There was a thickness here, a living pressure that seemed to watch and wait. I stopped near a gnarled old fir tree, brushing sweat and grime from my face. I pulled out the compass and map again, hoping for some reassurance. The needle wobbled erratically, as if disturbed by some magnetic interference. I cursed under my breath. The GPS on my phone had died hours ago, and now even the compass was betraying me. I tried to recall the path I'd taken, the fork near the stream, the broken branch, the strange carvings on a tree I spotted earlier. Those carvings had unsettled me. They weren't natural marks or signs of animal activity. They resembled crude symbols, scratched hurriedly into the bark, darkened by the slow seep of sap. I hadn't dared to linger then, but now, in the dimming light, I forced myself to look again. The symbols formed a pattern, some kind of language I didn't recognize. They sent a shiver down my spine, but there was something else, something that prickled at the back of my mind. The more I stared, the more it felt like the carvings were moving, shifting beneath my gaze. I blinked quickly, shaking off the feeling, and tore my eyes away. I needed to keep moving. As the sky darkened, I realized I was near one of the park's lesser-known trails. It was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and fallen branches, but it was the only route I could find that made sense. I stepped onto it, every step cautious, my ears straining for any sound other than my own footsteps and the distant call of an owl. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and soon the canopy overhead was so thick that the stars were hidden entirely. I pulled on my flashlight, its weak beam barely piercing the dense darkness. The beam caught on something ahead, a figure, perhaps, or just a trick of the light. I froze. The shape was too tall and rigid to be an animal, but it didn't move, didn't respond. Just stood there, a silhouette carved from shadow. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Slowly, I edged closer, every muscle tensed, ready to run or fight. As the flashlight's beam passed over it again, I saw that it wasn't a person but a tree, twisted and malformed, its branches gnarled into unnatural poses. But there was still something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. The bark seemed to writhe, just barely, as if alive. I blinked and looked away, shaking my head. I was losing my grip on reality. The stress, the exhaustion, I was imagining things. But then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, coming from just beyond the tree. It was subtle at first, a whisper beneath the rustling leaves, but it grew louder, more deliberate. It was a voice, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, hoarse and broken. I turned to run, heart hammering in my chest, but my foot caught on a root hidden beneath the fallen leaves. I stumbled, crashing to the ground. The voice grew louder, closer. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet. The flashlight flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed me whole. I fumbled with the batteries, hands trembling. The voice was almost upon me now. I could make out fragments, words that felt like warnings, or curses. The forest closed in, the shadows thickening, pressing against my skin. Finally, the light flickered back to life. I shone it wildly around, searching for the source of the voice. Nothing. No figure, no movement, just the empty trees swaying in the night wind. I forced myself to breathe. I needed to find shelter, to wait out the night. My mind reeled with questions. What was that voice? Was I truly alone? And if not, what did it want? I pressed forward along the trail, senses heightened, every snap of a twig or distant howl making me flinch. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Hours later, As the first pale hues of dawn began to seep through the branches, I found a narrow cave hidden behind a thicket of bushes. It wasn't much a tight, dark hollow, but it was shelter. I crawled inside, muscles trembling with exhaustion and relief. Outside, the forest remained silent, as if holding its breath. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to steady my thoughts. Sleep was impossible, but I needed rest. The night had drained something from me, a slow erosion of certainty and courage. And yet, as I sat there, I realized something. This place wasn't just dangerous because it was wild or forgotten. It was dangerous because it was alive in ways I couldn't understand. The forest wasn't just trees and animals, it was a presence, ancient and patient, and I was intruding on something much older than myself. With the morning light creeping closer, I resolved to keep moving, to find a way out. But deep down, I knew the forest wouldn't let me leave so easily. It was waiting, and it had plans for me. I just hoped I was strong enough to survive them. Story 2, The Tenant Beneath the Floorboards. When I first moved into the apartment on Langley Street, I convinced myself it was just another rental. A small, dimly lit place with peeling paint and a creaky floorboard in the living room. Nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I was used to cheap city apartments, the kind where the walls thinly masked the sounds of other tenants' lives and the plumbing groaned like an old man waking up. But this place felt different from the start. The landlord was a man named Mr. Grayson. I met him the day I signed the lease. He was in his late 60s, tall and thin, with a shock of white hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in years. His eyes, pale and sharp, held something that unsettled me, an unreadable weight behind their calm. When he handed me the keys, he smiled just a touch too widely, and his grip lingered on my hand longer than necessary. "Welcome to Langley Street," he said, voice low and almost deliberate. "This building has a long history. You'll find it accommodating once you settle in." I nodded, forcing a polite smile. Accommodating. The word echoed in my mind as I climbed the narrow staircase to my apartment on the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and something else I couldn't place, like old leather mixed with dust and a hint of iron. The apartment itself was small but livable. I had moved here for work, needing a place close to the city center without the insane rent prices. The rent was cheap, which in hindsight should have been my first warning. It was during my first night that things started to feel off. I hadn't yet unpacked most of my stuff, just a mattress on the floor and a few boxes by the window. The city's noise seeped through the thin walls, sirens, distant shouts, the muffled hum of traffic. But underneath it all, I thought I heard something else. A faint scratching or tapping, almost like nails against wood, coming from a wall behind the couch. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, trying to tell if it was just the building settling. Nothing sounded out of the ordinary, just the faint, irregular tapping continuing in the background. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was imagining things. The next morning, I called Mr. Grayson to ask if he knew about any maintenance issues. Maybe rodents? Maybe the pipes? "There's nothing wrong with the building," he told me flatly. "Sometimes old buildings make noises. It's nothing to worry about." His voice had that same calm, measured tone. I didn't press further. Over the next few days, I noticed other strange things. Doors in the hallway creaked open on their own, though the wind was never strong enough to push them. I'd sometimes catch glimpses of a shadow moving just out of the corner of my eye when I passed the stairwell window. Once, my kitchen faucet turned itself on in the middle of the night. I was sure I'd left it off, but when I checked the sink the next day, the water was dripping. One afternoon, I decided to explore the rest of the building, hoping to meet some neighbors and maybe get a better sense of the place. The other tenants were mostly older, quiet people who avoided eye contact in the hallways. They didn't say much, and when I asked about the building's history, Their answers were vague and dismissive. "The landlord's a good man," one elderly woman said, clutching her purse tightly. "Keeps things running smooth." "Not much to say about the place," an older man muttered as he shuffled past me. "Been here for 20 years. Their responses didn't satisfy me, but I let it go. That evening, as I sat on the window ledge with a book, the tapping started again, soft, slow, deliberate. I felt a cold draft from the hallway doorway behind me, which was odd because the building's main entrance was locked and the hallway shut tight. The sound grew louder, as if someone, or something, was tapping on the other side of the wall, trying to get my attention. I stood up, heart racing, and walked to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. As I passed the hallway door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I was positive I had shut it earlier. My fingers trembled as I reached out and pushed it closed firmly. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, light, but unmistakably footsteps, coming from the corridor outside my apartment. The sound wasn't steady, but it paced back and forth, as if someone was lingering. I waited, breath held, but when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. The hallway was empty and dimly lit, the only sound my own shallow breathing. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak, every distant sound felt amplified. I kept glancing at my phone, willing it to be morning. On the third day, I noticed the small thermostat on the wall had been tampered with. It was set to a temperature far lower than I had left it. I set it back to 72 degrees, but an hour later, it was back down to 58. I was sure I had locked the apartment door when I left for work, yet something about these changes felt deliberate, almost invasive. I wanted to confront Mr. Grayson, but every time I tried calling, the line went dead. No answer. Later, I saw him in the hallway, standing silently by the stairs, watching me with that same unsettling calm. "Everything all right?" he asked, voice soft. I hesitated. "The building can be temperamental," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "Sometimes it reveals itself only to those who listen." I frowned. "What do you mean by that?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll see." The weeks passed, and the strange occurrences escalated. Items in my apartment shifted position, my shoes, books, even my clothes. Nothing was ever outright missing, just moved or subtly altered. One morning, I woke to find my bedroom window wide open, despite having closed it tightly the night before. I didn't tell anyone. I was embarrassed, doubting my own memory, my own sanity. But the unease deepened. One night, I awoke to cold fingers brushing my face. I bolted upright, heart pounding, but found only the darkness and silence of my room. The city noises had dimmed to a hush, replaced by the distant sound of tapping, soft but insistent. I realized then that this wasn't just an old building making noises. It was something else, something hidden beneath the cracked walls and faded wallpaper. I didn't know what it wanted, but it was watching, waiting. And Mr. Grayson knew. That knowledge chilled me more than anything else. I was trapped in the apartment on Langley Street, caught in a game I didn't understand, with a landlord who smiled too much and a building that whispered secrets in the night. The day after the pipe burst, I woke with a tight knot in my stomach, a dull throb of unease lingering beneath the morning light. The apartment, despite the repairs, felt different, not just the dampness that hadn't quite dried, but a heaviness in the air, as if something unseen was settling in alongside the musty odor. I told myself it was just the fallout from the leak, a temporary thing. I was wrong. I had tried calling Mr. Elwood again, the landlord, but he didn't pick up. I left a voicemail asking when he'd come to check on the repairs and make sure everything was stable. No response. The silence was unsettling, but I told myself he was busy. He'd been distant since I moved in, a shadow lurking just outside the edges of the building's worn facade, never quite showing himself except in brief, brusque exchanges. Determined to shake the growing sense of wrongness, I decided to clean the apartment. The wet walls and the faint traces of mold made me anxious, but I needed to make the space livable again. As I wiped down the kitchen counter, I noticed a thin, almost imperceptible line of dust where the wall met the floor. It was too uniform, like someone had recently swept the area but deliberately avoided that particular edge. Curious, I knelt down and ran my fingers along the baseboard. The paint felt rough, uneven, and something about it made me lean closer. There was a faint smell, something faintly metallic and sharp that didn't belong in a kitchen. I flicked my fingers against the wall, and something clinked softly. I pulled the baseboard gently and it shifted. Heart pounding, I pulled harder, and a sliver of space opened between the wall and the floor. It wasn't much, but behind it was a narrow gap, just wide enough to fit my arm. I stared, trying to imagine what it could mean. Was there something inside the walls? I didn't want to believe it. I slid my arm in, fingers searching blindly until they touched cold metal. My hand trembled as I pulled out an old, rusted key. It was heavy and ornate, unlike anything that should have been left behind by a tenant or worker. The metal was dark with age, almost black, but the handle bore an elaborate engraving that looked like intertwined vines. The timing struck me then, the burst pipe, the landlord's silence, the way the apartment seemed to breathe with hidden life. I tucked the key into my pocket and tried to force the thought away. Maybe it was just some forgotten relic left by a previous tenant. Maybe it wasn't worth worrying about. But that night, the apartment shifted again. I lay awake listening to the usual creaks and hums of an old building settling, but beneath it, there was something else, a faint scratching, barely audible, like fingernails scraping against wood. I pressed my ear to the wall, but the noise stopped. I pulled back, heart racing, telling myself it was mice or plumbing. Still, the feeling of being watched crept in. The next morning, I woke late, exhausted despite the restless night. I was about to leave for work when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Have you found the key yet?" My fingers tightened around the phone. I stared at the message, unsure whether to reply or call the police. Instead, I typed back, "Who's this?" No response. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I deleted the message and locked the phone, but the dread wouldn't lift. Work was a blur of muted conversations and half-finished tasks. I kept glancing at my phone, expecting another message, but none came. The afternoon dragged, and when I finally got home, the sun was sinking behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the street. The hallway smelled different, colder, damp in a way that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside and paused. The apartment was darker than usual, the curtains drawn tight. I hadn't closed them that morning. The key burned in my pocket, a silent accusation. I straightened the curtains and flicked on the lights. In the corner of the living room, a small pile of dirt was scattered on the floor. I knelt down, staring at the disturbed dust. It looked deliberate, like someone had been here while I was out. I called Mr. Elwood's number again. Straight to voicemail. In the days that followed, the messages started coming more frequently. Sometimes they appeared on my phone, sometimes scrawled on notes slipped under my door or tucked behind picture frames. Each message was chillingly specific. "You're too curious. The walls remember. They listen." I told myself to ignore them, but the paranoia seeped in. I caught glimpses of shadows moving just beyond my vision, heard soft footsteps in the hallway late at night when no one should be there. I tried changing the locks, but discovered the front door's deadbolt had been tampered with, the screws loose, the mechanism jiggling under my touch. One evening, while trying to sleep, I heard the scratching again, louder this time, coming from the wall behind my bed. My breath caught as the noise morphed into faint whispering, syllables I couldn't understand but that sounded ancient and urgent. I sat up and pressed my ear against the cold plaster. The whispers stopped abruptly. I pulled away, heart hammering, and noticed the wallpaper had shifted slightly. A thin seam of light escaped from behind it. With trembling hands, I peeled back the edge of the wallpaper. Behind it was a small, jagged hole, just big enough to see into a narrow space beyond. The sight froze me. Inside were old photographs, yellowed and curled, scattered like forgotten evidence. Faces stared out, tenants from decades past, their eyes hollow and desperate. Suddenly, a low voice whispered from the shadows beyond the hole, "Leave, before it's too late." I slammed the wallpaper back in place, my breath ragged. The key in my pocket felt impossibly heavy, as if the secret it unlocked was a door better left closed. But the lingering threat in the messages and the silent menace behind the walls told me there was more, much more, to this building than I had ever imagined. I didn't know who or what was watching me, or what Mr. Elwood was hiding behind his indifferent facade. But one thing was certain, the apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was a trap, and I was caught inside it. I never thought I would find myself counting the hours until someone knocked on my door. After last night's conversation with Mr. Hargrove, the landlord, my nerves were frayed, and the apartment felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. The air was thick with that stale, musty smell that had settled into the walls, and every creak and groan of the building seemed louder, more deliberate. I kept glancing toward the peephole, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking just beyond. But the hallway remained empty, silent, and eerily still. All day, I tried to focus on work. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The rent was overdue, yes, but that hardly warranted the cold, unnerving tone Mr. Hargrove had used when he spoke through the door last night. He had said something about checking up on things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something darker beneath his words. My phone battery was running low, and the cold realization hit me that I hadn't charged it since the last time I'd been too distracted or anxious to care. As if on cue, it blinked off. No way out, no way to call anyone. The old building had spotty reception to begin with, and the thick concrete walls didn't help. I stuffed the dead phone into my jacket pocket and sat down on the threadbare couch, staring out the window at the faded brick facade of the neighboring building. The afternoon dragged on. I tried to read, but the words blurred together. Every time the wind rattled the window panes, my heart jumped. The sun dipped lower, and the light in the hallway faded into a sickly yellow glow. I thought about turning on the hallway light, but the breaker was in the basement, locked behind a heavy, rusty door I'd never seen opened. Then came the knock. It was quiet at first, a soft tap, like a polite visitor. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The sound was too deliberate, too methodical to be accidental. I edged toward the door, fingers trembling as I clutched the cold brass doorknob. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just me," came the low voice, unmistakably Mr. Hargrove's. "Thought I'd drop by, see how you're holding up." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door a crack, the chain still latched. He leaned in, his face half in shadow. The light from the hallway was dim, but enough to catch the sharp lines of his face, the thinness of his lips pressed tight into a line. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "Everything okay in here?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, just tired, that's all." He glanced past me into the apartment, his gaze lingering a moment too long on the peeling wallpaper and the crooked picture frames. "Good. Because I'll be checking in regularly from now on. I'm sure you understand." I swallowed hard, nodding again. He straightened up, the chain rattling as he pulled the door closed. Then, just before he disappeared down the hall, he called out, "Remember, the lease says no overnight guests." "I'll be watching." The door clicked shut, and I was left standing there, the silence settling over me like a blanket. I backed away, locking the door and sliding the chain latch back into place. The room felt colder, darker somehow. I wondered if this was how the other tenants had felt before they left, if they had felt the weight of his gaze pressing down on them, suffocating in its intensity. I moved to the window again, peering out just as a figure appeared at the end of the hall. It was the maintenance man, a shadowy silhouette that paused and looked up toward my door before disappearing down the stairs. I considered calling out, but my voice felt too small, swallowed by the building. That night, sleep was impossible. The apartment echoed with every creak and groan. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting. Then the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves raw and twitching. I knew I had to get out, but the rent was past due, and I had nowhere else to go. The grip of the building tightened around me, and I could almost hear it whispering through the walls, telling me to stay, telling me I belonged here. I didn't know what Mr. Hargrove wanted from me, but I was certain it wasn't just the rent. The night crept in again, thick and suffocating. I tried to focus on packing, but each box felt heavier, as if the shadows themselves were pulling at the corners of my vision. Then, the faintest scrape, like nails raking slowly downward, echoed from the hallway. I froze. The wall seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding in rhythm with my pounding heart. A cold draft swept beneath my door, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted blood. The whispers returned, barely audible at first, then swelling into a chorus of desperate voices, pleading, warning, demanding. I pressed my back against the door, trembling, as the handle began to turn with agonizing slowness. In that moment, the truth clawed its way to the surface. Mr. Hargrove wasn't collecting rent. He was collecting souls. And tonight, he intended to collect mine. The night I finally decided to confront Martin, something in the air felt off, thicker, almost suffocating. I had spent the last week piecing together every oddity that had slipped past my own judgment since moving into the building. The locks Martin installed were more complicated than necessary, with deadbolts and chains that clicked ominously at the slightest touch. The hallway lights flickered in patterns that suggested more than just faulty wiring. And then there was the smell, an undercurrent of something sour, metallic, barely noticeable unless you paused in the silence. I stood outside his office door on the 3rd floor, the same floor my apartment was on, clutching the keys I'd found tucked inside the old radiator valve in my unit. The discovery had been a fluke. I'd been trying to figure out how to shut off the radiator when my fingers brushed against a small metal box taped behind the valve cover. Inside, the keys looked old, worn, labeled only with faded numbers. One of them matched the lock on the office door. Up until this point, I'd been irrationally hesitant to use them. Martin had been unnervingly polite when we spoke, but that politeness had a veneer, thin and brittle. When I asked about the extra locks or the strange noises at night, he'd smile, brush it off as old building quirks, and change the subject with practiced ease. But the pressure was building. I needed answers. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The door clicked open with a groan, revealing a small room lined with filing cabinets and shelves filled with ledgers and folders. The air inside was colder, despite the radiator hissing softly behind me. A faint hum of electronics came from a corner. I crossed the threshold, the weight of the silence pressing down. A dusty desk sat cluttered with papers, a flickering desk lamp casting uneven shadows. I rifled through the files, each folder labeled with dates and names, tenants from over the past decade. At first, it seemed mundane, but as I dug deeper, the tone shifted. Some files were incomplete, others marked with red ink. I pulled out a folder from 2009 labeled with a tenant's name, Evelyn Moore. Her file detailed a tenancy lasting 2 months, after which the notes stopped abruptly. Curious, I searched for any police reports or eviction notices. None were listed. Instead, there were several annotations about unusual behavior, withdrawal, and disappearance. The last entry was chilling. Subject last seen entering apartment 3B. No contact since. My heart thudded as I realized 3B was the unit below mine and the apartment that had been empty since I moved in. The door was sealed shut with fresh paint, the windows curtained tightly from the inside. I'd always assumed the place was simply vacant. With trembling hands, I searched for more. Other folders revealed similar patterns, tenants who left suddenly or vanished without explanation. A name here, a case there, each ending in silence or a vague note about mental instability or relocation due to personal reasons. None of them had official records of moving out. I heard footsteps outside the door, sharp and deliberate. My breath caught. I slid the files back into place and switched off the desk lamp just as Martin's shadow fell across the threshold. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, voice low but steady. I tried to keep my voice even. "Why do you have files on tenants who disappeared? What happened to them?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You're digging into things you don't understand." His eyes were cold, calculating. "This building has history, things you wouldn't believe. But it's not the place for you. You need to move on. Why keep the apartment below mine locked and empty? Why all the extra security measures?" I demanded. He sighed, as if tired of repeating himself. "That apartment's been closed for years. There was an incident. Let's just say it's better off that way." I pressed further. "What kind of incident?" "Evelyn Moore's file says she disappeared." "Are you saying she vanished inside that apartment?" Martin's gaze darkened. "Her story is complicated. She was troubled, and some tenants bring trouble with them. The building, it reacts to certain energies. I keep things under control for everyone's sake." I shook my head, frustrated and more afraid than ever. "This isn't normal. People have disappeared. I'm calling the police." He smiled, but it held no warmth. "You can call whoever you want. But if you look too deeply, you might find things you don't want to see. And some doors, once opened, don't close easily." The warning hung in the air as I slipped past him and back into the hallway. The building's low hum felt oppressive, as if it was watching me, waiting. That night, sleep was elusive. Shadows moved just beyond the edge of my vision, and the faint smell of rust and decay seeped through the vents. I kept hearing soft knocks coming from the sealed apartment below. Each time I approached the door, the knocking stopped. The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. It was typed, crisp, and unsigned. It read, "Leave before it's too late." I wanted to ignore it, but the unease had settled deep in my bones. I realized this wasn't just about the building's age or its landlord's eccentricities. Something was wrong, something that ran deeper, darker. Curiosity pushed me toward 3B again, this time with a crowbar I had borrowed from a neighbor. The lock was brittle behind the layers of paint, and with some effort, I managed to pry the door open. Inside, the room was untouched by time, almost like a shrine. Personal belongings were scattered, clothes folded neatly, a diary on the bedside table, photographs pinned to the wall. But there was no sign of Evelyn herself. I opened the diary, flipping through pages filled with spiraling handwriting about fear, voices in the walls, and shadows that watched. Her last entry made my blood run cold. "They say the landlord keeps us safe, but I think he's the one trapping us." I hear the knocking again. "If anyone finds this, don't stay here." I dropped the diary and stumbled toward the window, desperate for fresh air. Then I heard it knocking, coming from inside the walls, slow and deliberate. I slammed the door shut and bolted down the stairs, heart pounding, the note's warning echoing in my mind. Martin was waiting on the landing, his expression unreadable. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "Some tenants never really leave." The truth settled over me like a shroud. This building was less a home and more a cage. And I wasn't sure if I was the prisoner or the prey. The knock came just as I was about to climb into bed. Sharp, deliberate, 3 loud raps against the thin wooden door. I froze, the half-emptied bottle of cheap whiskey still in my hand. It was nearly midnight, and I'd only just started to feel the edges of sleep soften the day's tight coil of anxiety. The sound was wrong, intrusive, the sort of sudden interruption that doesn't belong in a quiet apartment on an ordinary night. I stood and padded to the door, eyes narrowing through the peephole. Nothing but the dim corridor light and shadows stretched down the hallway. I thought I might have imagined it until the knocking came again, this time softer, more hesitant, almost like a question. I stepped back and thought about ignoring it, convincing myself that whoever it was would leave. But then I heard his voice, the landlord's, low and gravelly, barely more than a whisper. "Open up, please." The voice was unmistakable. Mr. Harlow had always been unnerving, but this was something else. It wasn't the brusque landlord who barged in with a passkey once a month for routine inspections. It was quieter, like something grudging, almost pleading. I hesitated, then unlocked the door just enough to peer out. He stood there, his face half in shadow, eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "I'm sorry to bother you this late," he said. "But I need to talk. It's important." I remembered the keys I'd found tucked behind the radiator in the hallway just 2 days ago. They were unlabeled but felt like they belonged to parts of the building off limits to tenants, places Mr. Harlow never mentioned. I'd been tempted to explore, but the uneasy feeling in my gut kept me from venturing too far. Now I wondered if this was connected. "Come in," I said finally, stepping aside. He entered without hesitation, carrying a small leather-bound notebook. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the peeling wallpaper, the cracked window pane, the faint smell of damp that had settled into the corners. "Thank you," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. We sat opposite each other on the threadbare couch, the silence stretching between us. The notebook lay closed on the coffee table. "I've noticed things," he said after a long pause. "About the building. About the tenants." I swallowed and nodded, unsure what he meant. "There are irregularities," he continued. "Not just maintenance issues. I've found discrepancies in the rent payments, missing records, tenants who vanish without notice." My heart quickened. Vanish? I had heard whispers from others in the building, rumors about people moving out suddenly, leaving belongings behind, never telling anyone. But I'd always dismissed it as gossip, the kind of talk that thrives in aging apartment complexes. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. He opened the notebook and flipped to a page filled with cramped handwriting and dates. "Because you're new. And because I need someone who's not part of the usual cycle to help me figure this out. You've noticed the strange noises in the basement, right? The cold spots in the hallways?" I nodded slowly. The basement, the place tenants rarely went, the one area I'd been warned to avoid. I'd heard footsteps echoing at odd hours, whispers that didn't make sense, and a smell like rot that sometimes drifted up through the vents. "There's something beneath this building," he whispered, glancing around as if the walls might be listening. "Something that feeds on us. On the people who live here. The missing tenants, they didn't just leave. They were taken." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it all as madness, but the fear knotting my stomach made it hard to look away. "Taken by what?" He shook his head. "I don't know. But it's tied to the landlord's office and the old storage rooms in the basement. I've been trying to find proof, But there's a reason the previous tenants left without a trace. They knew something was wrong. The room felt colder all at once, the shadows lengthening as if pulled by some unseen force. I realized that in the corner, the old radiator rattled softly, the sound oddly like a warning. "Why come to me?" I asked again. "Because you're the only tenant who hasn't been here long enough to be affected. And because you opened the door. Most won't anymore." I looked at him, this man I thought was just a gruff landlord with too many keys and too many secrets. Now he seemed like something else entirely, someone desperate and afraid. "What do you want me to do?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Help me get to the basement. Help me find out what's really going on before it's too late." We sat there for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. I thought of the locked door at the end of the hall, the faint sound of something moving just beyond, the cold that seemed to seep from the floorboards themselves. I nodded. He smiled, just for a second, a strange, hopeful curve to his lips. "Good. Tonight. After midnight." As he left, I felt the door click shut behind him and the silence settle once more. But it wasn't the same silence. It was a silence charged with something waiting, watching. I realized I hadn't felt entirely safe in this building since I moved in, but now the fear had sharpened into something that demanded action. I spent the next few hours pacing, listening to the creaks and groans of the old apartment, the faint drip of water somewhere deep below. When the clock finally chimed midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar from my closet and headed for the staircase leading down to the basement. The door was exactly where Mr. Harlow said it would be, a heavy metal slab with rust creeping along its edges. I hesitated, hand on the handle, then pushed it open. The stale, damp air hit me like a wall. The basement was darker than I expected, the flashlight beam barely penetrating the thick shadows. I caught sight of old furniture draped in sheets, stacks of dusty boxes, and the cracked concrete walls. But there was something else, a faint sound, like breathing, echoing off the far end of the room. Mr. Harlow appeared behind me, his flashlight steady. "Stay close," he said. We moved forward, the floor creaking beneath us. Then the breathing stopped, replaced by a low, whispering hum that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out. I was plunged into pitch black. I reached for the crowbar, heart pounding so loud I feared it might give me away. Then I heard it, a scrape, slow and deliberate, coming from just beyond the beam of my flashlight as it sputtered back to life. Something was moving in the dark, and it was coming straight for us. Story 3, Whispers from the Forgotten Shaft. I never imagined that the old mine on the edge of town would become the source of the worst night I ever lived through. I had heard stories everyone had, but I thought they were just local legends, the kind of thing townspeople spin to keep curious kids from wandering too far. When I finally convinced a few friends to explore the place one late afternoon, I thought we were just chasing a bit of harmless adventure. Only, as the sun dropped below the hills and shadows crept into the narrow tunnel, I realized how wrong I was. It started with a dare. My friend Mark was the kind of guy who was always looking for a thrill, the kind who never stopped talking about proving his courage. The mine had been sealed off for decades, ever since the last collapse, but a small entrance remained, half buried under rusted metal sheets and crumbled rock. When Mark found a way through, he was ecstatic, and despite my hesitation, I followed. The air inside was thick and cold, smelling of damp stone and stale earth. Our flashlight beams wavered against the walls, revealing faded warnings and rusted equipment left to decay. The farther we went, the narrower the passage became, slippery with mud and broken debris. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip of water somewhere ahead and the distant echoes of our footsteps. I kept thinking about the stories, how miners had vanished, how strange sounds sometimes emerged from the depths, how no one had dared go past the first few tunnels for years. I laughed it off at first, But as we descended further, the atmosphere changed. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows grew heavier, and a strange unease settled over me. We reached a fork in the tunnel where a rusted sign hung crookedly, its letters barely legible. Mark insisted we take the left path, claiming it led to the old shaft they'd used to extract ore. Reluctantly, I agreed. As we moved deeper, the ground beneath us shifted, and the ceiling lowered. Our footsteps echoed louder, and suddenly, a soft thud sounded behind us. I stopped, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Mark shook his head, shining his flashlight back the way we had come. "Probably just rocks falling," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We pressed on, the beam of our lights bouncing over jagged walls. Then, without warning, the ground trembled beneath our feet. A low rumble rose from the earth, and dust cascaded from the ceiling. We froze as the tunnel shuddered again, louder this time. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mark's arm. We sprinted toward the entrance, panic clawing at my throat. Behind us, the sound of crumbling rock chased us, echoing through the narrow passage like a warning. When we finally burst into the fading daylight, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, the tension still gripping my muscles. Neither of us spoke on the way back to town, but the memory of that collapse haunted me. The next day, I found myself drawn back to the mine, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the natural dangers of a forgotten shaft. I went alone this time, flashlight in hand, determined to prove to myself that nothing was there. The tunnel was quieter, almost unnervingly so. The air was colder, and the mud beneath my boots seemed to cling tighter. I followed the main corridor deeper, ignoring the small side passages that branched off like veins. Then, I saw a narrow crack in the wall, barely visible in the dim light, with strange scratches etched into the stone around it. Curiosity outweighed caution. I pressed my hand against the rough surface and felt a faint vibration, like a pulse beneath the rock. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I stepped back, uneasy, but before I could turn away, a whisper brushed past my ear. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, just a trick of the wind moving through the tunnel. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time. A voice, low and hoarse, speaking words I couldn't understand. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. The beam of my flashlight flickered wildly, then steadied, illuminating the cracked wall and the dark hollow beyond. It wasn't a crack at all, it was an opening, wide enough to slip through. Against every instinct, I crawled through the narrow gap and found myself in a small cavern. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air smelled of something ancient and rotten. In the center, a shallow pool reflected my flashlight's beam. The water was oily black, and at the bottom, faint shapes shifted, too indistinct to recognize but unmistakably alive. I knelt beside the pool, heart hammering, and that's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, deep impressions in the mud leading away from the water and disappearing into a dark tunnel I hadn't noticed before. The footprints were small, irregular, like something that moved on all fours. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but the pattern was too deliberate, too human. A sudden noise shattered the silence. Something scraped against the rock behind me, sharp and deliberate. I whipped around, shining my light into the darkness, but saw only shadows. My breath came fast now, and I realized I was now alone. I scrambled out of the cavern and back through the narrow opening, heart racing. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the pale morning light with the wind drying the sweat on my face. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the dark. But I knew the truth. Whatever lived inside that mind was still there, waiting. That night, sleep evaded me. The images of the black pool and the fresh footprints haunted my thoughts. I kept hearing that whisper, faint but persistent, like a warning or a call. I knew one thing for sure, returning to that mine without knowing what I was dealing with was no longer a choice. It was a mistake I couldn't afford to make again. The lantern's weak glow barely pierced the thick, suffocating darkness that clung to the tunnel walls. I could hear the slow drip of water somewhere deep inside the mine, each drop echoing like a distant, morbid heartbeat. It was colder than I'd expected, the air stale and damp, smelling faintly of rust and rot. I wiped sweat from my brow with a trembling hand, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself I was only going to take a quick look inside, check for any signs of collapse or dangerous pockets of gas. Just a routine inspection, like I'd done 100 times before. But as I stepped deeper, the uneven floor crunching underfoot with broken rock and dust, I realized I hadn't prepared for what I might find. The mine was old, decades, maybe a century since anyone had worked these shafts regularly. I'd seen the faded warning signs tacked near the entrance, no entry, unsafe, abandoned. But curiosity won out, or maybe something worse. I'd been drawn here by the story of the collapsed tunnel and the missing workers, a grim tale whispered by locals who said the mine was haunted by those who never made it out. I didn't believe in ghosts, but as the narrow passage swallowed me whole, I understood how fear could grow in a place like this. Every step I took seemed louder than it should be, my boots scraping against loose shale, the sound magnified in the hollow silence. The walls were slick with moisture, and every few feet, the ceiling dripped water that landed on my shoulders or splattered onto the uneven floor. My lamp flickered once, then steadied, casting grotesque shadows that danced just beyond the range of my sight. I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye more than once, but when I turned, there was nothing but the cold stone, stretching endlessly. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, I reached the junction where the main shaft branched into smaller galleries. The air was heavier here, the smell more pungent, a mixture of earth, decay, and something metallic, like blood. I hesitated, the hair at the back of my neck rising. I wasn't sure if I was listening for something or trying to quiet my own pounding heart. Then I heard it, a faint scratching, almost imperceptible over the distant drip of water. I stopped moving and strained my ears. The sound came again, low and deliberate, like nails scraping against rock. I backed up slowly, telling myself it was probably just some trapped animal, or a loose rock shifting in the dark. But the scratching grew louder, accompanied by a faint, wet rasping that made my stomach churn. I wanted to run back, but a strange pull kept me rooted in place. Maybe it was the voice inside my head telling me to find out what was making that noise. Maybe it was something else. I edged into the side tunnel where the sound originated, the beam of my lantern trembling as I moved forward. The tunnel narrowed abruptly, forcing me to crouch. The walls here were covered in strange, deep scratches, gouges that looked too deliberate to be natural. Some of them were fresh, dark, and glistening with moisture. Then I saw it. A figure huddled near the back of the tunnel, half shrouded in shadow. At first, I thought it was a lost miner, maybe someone trapped here, but as I got closer, I realized this wasn't a person. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. The eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken pits that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, dragging one clawed hand along the wall as if searching for something. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The creature hissed, a dry, rasping sound, then lunged toward me. I barely dodged, scrambling through the narrow tunnel until I burst back into the main shaft, gasping for air. My lantern swung wildly, casting chaotic shadows on the walls, and in that frantic moment, I realized I had no idea how to get out. The passages all looked the same, twisting like a maze. Panic surged through me, raw and sharp. I tried to calm myself, pressing my back against the wall as I listened. The tunnel was silent now, but that silence was worse than the scratching or the hiss. It was a silence that promised the thing was still nearby, waiting. I remembered the emergency beacon in my pack and fumbled to pull it out, my hand shaking so badly I dropped it twice before I finally got the button. The small red light blinked once, then twice, but no signal came through. No response. The mine was so deep underground that none of my gear worked properly. I was alone. I had to find a way out before whatever the thing was came back. I forced myself to keep moving, marking the walls with charcoal from my pack to avoid going in circles. Every now and then, I heard noises, soft thumps, scraping, the occasional guttural whisper that seemed to come from just behind me but vanished when I turned. My mind raced with every terrible possibility. Was this creature the product of some mining accident? A man driven mad and transformed by isolation? Or something older, something that had lived in the dark long before the miners arrived? Hours slipped by, or was it minutes? Time lost meaning in that oppressive blackness. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and the cold seeped into my bones. Then, just when hope felt completely gone, I glimpsed a faint glimmer ahead. Fresh air. A shaft of daylight filtered through a crack in the rock. I ran toward it, stumbling over debris, until I burst through a narrow opening and fell onto loose gravel outside. The sun was setting, casting bruised purple shadows over the desolate hillside. I lay there for a long time, gasping, listening for any sign that the creature had followed me out. Nothing but the wind in the trees and the distant call of birds. I wanted to believe I was safe. But as I looked back at the gaping hole in the earth, I knew the mine still held secrets. And whatever lurked in its depths wasn't done with me yet. The air had grown colder by the time I realized how far I'd wandered from our original path. The narrow tunnel, which had once felt like a promising lead, now seemed like a suffocating artery carved into the mountain, twisting and collapsing inward with every step. I stopped, pressing my back against the jagged wall, and tried to steady my breath. My light flickered, casting long, trembling shadows that danced just beyond the reach of the dim beam. I didn't know how long I'd been down here, or how deep. The quiet was absolute, punctuated only by the soft scrape of my boots against loose gravel and the distant drip of water echoing somewhere unseen. It wasn't just silence, it was a vacuum, unnatural and heavy, like the air itself had been sucked clean of life. My heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time since entering the mine, I felt a primal urge to retreat to find the face of daylight again. But turning around wasn't simple. The walls curved, the passage narrowing, leading into a junction I hadn't noticed before. At the fork, the left tunnel was choked with debris and shadow, but the right path stretched further into blackness, swallowing my light whole. I hesitated, debating which way to go, when a sudden sound stopped me cold. It was a faint tapping, rhythmic and uneven, echoing down the right tunnel. At first, I thought it might be the settling of rock, or a trick of my nerves. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was communicating. My skin prickled. I called out, voice cracking, but the cavern swallowed my words. I forced myself to move forward, every step heavier than the last. The beam in my hand barely penetrated the gloom, revealing nothing but rough stone and scattered fragments of timber from old supports. The tapping continued, faster now, irregular, like a heartbeat or a warning. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, barely catching myself on a rusted pipe protruding from the wall. My light flickered wildly, threatening to die. Panic surged, but I forced calm, steadying the lantern with both hands. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. I could barely make out shapes in the gloom, broken carts, piles of rotted wooden beams, and a lattice of rusted rails disappearing into holes in the walls. The tapping had stopped. An eerie stillness settled, thick and oppressive. I moved inward, senses straining. The walls here were slick with moisture, and a faint musty smell mixed with something metallic, old blood, maybe, or rust. I shivered despite the damp heat. My footsteps echoed loudly, too loud in the unnatural quiet. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched near the far wall, half shrouded in shadow. It was hunched over something, its movements jerky and twitchy. My breath caught. I called out again, but the figure didn't flinch. I edged closer, the beam illuminating twisted, dirt-caked clothes and a face I could barely make out, pale, gaunt, eyes wild and unblinking. The figure looked less human the closer I got, like a broken marionette left to rot in the dark. Its fingers brushed over the ground in a mechanical rhythm, tracing patterns in the dust. I asked if it was okay, but there was no answer, only the soft scraping sound of the fingers dragging through the dirt. The figure muttered something under its breath, unintelligible and broken. Suddenly, it looked up. Our eyes met, and I swear the air shifted, a cold wave of something ancient and hungry. I stepped back, heart hammering. The figure scrambled to its feet with unnatural speed. A guttural noise escaped its throat, a sound like pain and rage tangled together. I turned and ran, lungs burning, feet slipping on the wet stone. Behind me, the sound of pursuit began, heavy, uneven footsteps crashing through the debris. I didn't look back. The tunnel narrowed again, and I wove through the maze of broken rails and fallen beams, desperation guiding me. The tapping returned, louder and frantic, echoing off the walls in a frenzied pattern. It didn't make sense. Was it a warning or a call? My mind scrambled, trying to piece together what I'd just seen. I burst through another narrow passage, nearly tripping as the ground gave way beneath me. I caught myself on a rusty ladder, heart pounding so hard I thought I might be hurt. The ladder creaked under my weight as I scrambled upward, the walls closing in. At the top, I emerged into a low-ceilinged shaft, dimly lit by the fading light of my lantern. I forced myself to slow, listening. The pursuit had stopped. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, charged, expectant. I slumped against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My hands shook violently, and sweat dripped into my eyes. I thought I was alone, but then I heard it again, a low, rasping whisper, barely audible, coming from the shadows just beyond the light. I called out, voice breaking. No answer. Then the whisper grew louder, words forming, but not in any language I recognized, an ancient, guttural chant that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. I dropped to my knees, overwhelmed by a cold I couldn't shake. The air around me thickened, and a faint vibration hummed through the stone beneath my fingers. That was when the ground trembled. A deep rumble rocked the tunnel, dust falling from the ceiling. I scrambled to my feet, heart thudding wildly. The walls groaned, and somewhere deep in the bowels of the mine, something shifted. I had no idea what I was running from or if I could even escape it. But I knew one thing, the mine was alive in ways I hadn't imagined, and I was trapped in its dark, hungry heart. The air grew colder as I pressed deeper into the mine's jagged belly, the weight of the earth above me pressing in with a quiet menace. My flashlight's beam trembled in the narrow passage, catching on scattered rocks and the faint, glistening seams of mineral deposits. Every step forward felt like a step away from the world I knew, and closer to something I could not yet name. I hadn't gone far since the collapse that trapped me here. The initial panic had given way to a cautious determination. I needed to find another exit or at least a place to signal for help. The map I'd found in the abandoned foreman's office told of a rarely used ventilation shaft a few hundred meters east, but the tunnels were more maze than avenue, and landmarks were few. The mine had an unnatural stillness, the kind that presses heavily against your senses, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The sounds of the outside world had long since faded, no birds, no wind, no distant traffic, only the faint drip of water echoing like a slow, irregular heartbeat. That sound was the only proof I had that time was passing at all. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against the rough, damp stone. My throat was parched, my water bottle was empty. The stale taste of dust lingered in my mouth. The darkness behind me was thick and suffocating, pressing like a living thing. I tried to ignore the steady ache in my knees, the dull throb in my temples. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails scratching stone, coming from ahead. I froze. The beam of my flashlight flicked toward the noise, sweeping over a collapsed pile of rubble and broken timbers. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting loose debris, but the scraping continued, deliberate, rhythmic. It wasn't natural. I swallowed hard, telling myself it could be an animal, rats or bats maybe, but the sound was too heavy, too precise. As I watched, a shadow shifted in the corner of the tunnel, just beyond the reach of light. My heart jumped. I swung the flashlight toward it, and a pair of glinting eyes reflected back at me briefly before disappearing into the darkness. I wanted to call out, to ask if anyone was there, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I took a cautious step forward. The air seemed to grow colder still, and an almost imperceptible whisper of movement brushed past my ear. I spun around, swinging the light wildly, but found only empty blackness. The scrape came again, louder this time. I forced myself forward, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I moved. The walls seemed to close in around me, the low ceiling forcing me to crouch in places. The smell of damp earth mixed with something metallic, old rust, or something fouler. I rounded a corner, the narrow tunnel ending in a wooden door, partially ajar. It was the ventilation shaft entrance, just as the map had promised. Relief surged through me, sharp and sudden. I reached out and pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Beyond lay a steep ladder disappearing upward into a shaft of faint, gray daylight. I scrambled up, my fingers biting into the rusted rungs, my legs aching beneath me. Just as I neared the top, I heard a sharp crack behind me, the door slamming shut with a violent thud. My heart seized in my chest. I looked down the shaft. No one was there. Only shadows. I pulled myself up into the fresh air, the sky gray and heavy overhead. The ground outside was wet and churned with mud. I was free, but the mine was behind me, silent and watching. I didn't stop moving until I was sure I was far enough away. But even then, as I sat shivering beneath a twisted stand of trees, the memory of those eyes haunted me. Whatever was down there, whatever had scratched at the walls, it was still waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me deeper than any cold, that it hadn't wanted me to leave. The forest around me seemed to close in, the skeletal branches clawing at the sky like the gnarled fingers of something long dead. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt through my spine, as if the mine's darkness had rooted itself inside me. I knew I should keep moving, head toward the nearest road or sign of civilization, but my legs refused to obey. Instead, I sat frozen, the cold seeping into my bones, the pit in my stomach growing heavier with each passing moment. Then I heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind, a whisper so low I wondered if it was just my imagination. But it was there. A voice. No, not a voice as we know it. More like the hiss of air escaping from a rusted pipe, or the slow creak of ancient wood settling in a house long abandoned. My heart hammered as I scanned the undergrowth, half expecting to see that pair of eyes glinting back at me from the shadows. I told myself it was nothing. Just the wind, the forest breathing. But deep down, I knew better. The mine's presence had seeped into the world around me, wrapping tendrils of unease around the trees, the mud, even the air itself. I could feel it an itch beneath my skin, something clawing just beneath the surface of my thoughts. I forced myself to stand, every muscle protesting, and began walking again, this time toward the east where the sun, barely visible through the clouds, promised a way out. But as I moved, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that dark shape slipping silently through the trees, watching, waiting. The world had shifted, I realized, irrevocably. The mine was no longer a place beneath the earth. It had become a shadow cast over everything, a wound that would not heal. And somewhere, out there in the gray, cold world, whatever had wanted me to stay was still out there, patient, relentless, hungry for its next visitor. The faint scrape of my boot against the loose gravel echoed off the cavern walls, a steady, hollow rhythm that seemed to mock the silence pressing in around me. The air was thick with dust and damp, smelling metallic and mineral heavy, a scent I'd come to associate with this underground nightmare. I kept my hand pressed against the cold stone beside me, steadying myself with every careful step into the deeper, darker parts of the mine. I wished I could say that this was the first time I'd felt the weight of this place, its oppressive nature, but it wasn't. Each time I returned to the mine, the sense of being watched grew heavier, more tangible. Today was no different, only worse. The flashlight, clenched tightly in my palm, was my only companion, its beam narrow and weak against the cavern's vast shadows. I had no idea how far I'd walked, but the walls seemed to close in, their surfaces weeping damp water that left dark streaks like veins bleeding into the rock. The sound of dripping, tiny, insistent plinks punctuated the silence, but beneath it, I thought I could hear something else. A faint scratching, like nails dragged across stone, or maybe the skitter of claws too big and too fast for a rat. I stopped, my breath catching. I scanned the beam slowly from wall to wall, then upward, where the ceiling arched out of reach, swallowed by darkness. Nothing moved. I told myself I was imagining it, letting my mind play tricks in the isolation, the fear. But then the scratching came again, louder this time, nearer. I couldn't tell from which direction, so I turned, trying to trace the noise. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would betray me, echoing through the hollow tunnels. The beam landed on an old, rusted cart half buried in rubble, its wheels frozen in place, rails warped and broken farther down the line. The noise stopped instantly, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible thud, as if something heavy had shifted. I swallowed and forced myself to move forward again. This part of the mine had been sealed off years ago, after the collapse, but I found an opening last time, a narrow fissure that led into unexplored tunnels. The stories they told about this section were enough to keep anyone else away, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, had driven me back. And now, with every step, I regretted it. The beam caught on something hanging from the ceiling, thin, fibrous strands, translucent and shimmering faintly in the light. I blinked, leaning in closer. Webbing. But this was no ordinary spider's handiwork. The threads were thick, almost rope-like, and stretched between stalactites, forming a tangled web that blocked part of the passage. I reached out, hand trembling, and brushed the strands aside. They were sticky and cold, and as I pulled them apart, a sudden sharp snapping sound cracked through the tunnel. The web quivered violently, then ripped free, releasing a flurry of dust and tiny insects that darted into the beam before scattering into the dark. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and the tunnel seemed to shift around me. Shadows lengthened and coalesced in the corners of my vision. I fought the rising panic, telling myself this was just an old mine trying to swallow me whole with its hazards. But then I heard it, breathing. Not mine, not ragged or forced from exertion, but slow, deliberate, and measured. Someone or something was down here with me. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came again, closer this time, shallow exhales punctuated by the soft scrape of movement. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam catching a glimpse of something crouched near the wall, a figure, hunched and blurred in the darkness. It vanished before I could focus, swallowed by a side tunnel that gaped like a mouth. I hesitated, every instinct screaming to run back the way I came, but my legs refused to obey. Then the scratching started anew, but this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. The sound was animalistic, yet there was an intelligence behind it, as though whatever made it was watching, waiting. I swallowed hard and forced myself forward, stepping into the side tunnel. The walls closed in tighter here, the ceiling dipping so low I had to bend, scraping my shoulder on rough stone. The beam flickered, and my heart stopped. I pounded the flashlight's side with a shaking fist, willing it to stay on. When it finally steadied, I scanned ahead and saw the tunnel ended abruptly at a jagged chamber. The air grew colder, and the silence thickened. Then the scratching stopped. I stood there in the stillness, the beam trembling as I held it out before me. The only sound was my ragged breathing. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber, a sudden collapse of rock from the ceiling. Dust exploded around me, and I dropped to the ground, shielding my face. When the dust settled, I looked up and realized that the path back was blocked. The tunnel had collapsed behind me. Panic surged cold and sharp. I scrambled up, shining the light frantically down the new debris heap. There was no way through. I was trapped. The growl returned, low and menacing, from somewhere deeper in the chamber. I could see faint, skittering movements at the edges of the light, too quick to track, but unmistakably alive. I backed away slowly, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. I reached out again, fingers brushing the cold stone, looking for another way out, a crack, a hole, anything. But the walls were smooth here, natural rock with no sign of the man-made tunnels that had brought me this far. A cold realization sank in. This wasn't just a mine. This place was alive, and it was hunting me. I gripped the flashlight tighter and moved forward, deeper into the chamber, the sounds closing in, the darkness alive with unseen eyes. No matter how careful I was, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to leave this place alive. Story 4, Beneath the Forgotten Factory Walls. I had always liked jogging in the late afternoon. It was the only time my schedule seemed to line up with the fading daylight, and the local park near my apartment was usually quiet enough to clear my head. That Tuesday felt like any other, overcast, a little humid, the air thick from a day of rain that had finally stopped. I left my apartment around 5, lacing up my shoes in the cramped entryway of the building, the familiar scrape of rubber on concrete somehow comforting. The park wasn't far, just a 10-minute run down the cracked sidewalks that wound through the neighborhood. I set off at a steady pace, earbuds in, playlist shuffled to something mellow. The streets were mostly empty, a few cars parked along the curb, the occasional dog walker or parent pushing a stroller. It was the kind of evening you didn't think twice about wandering alone. About halfway through the 2-mile loop, I noticed a man sitting on a bench under a large oak tree near the small playground. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up, obscuring most of his face. His hands were folded in his lap, and he looked too still, like he was waiting for something or someone. I didn't pay much attention at first. People sat on benches all the time, sometimes reading or scrolling on their phones. But something didn't feel right. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of his eyes, sharp, unblinking, fixed on me. My stride faltered for a second, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was tired, or had been there a long time. I kept going. A few minutes later, the jog route curved along the edge of a small pond, its surface still and reflecting the gray sky. The path narrowed here, hemmed in by tall weeds and scrub. I slowed down, my breath heavier now, muscles warming up. Then I heard footsteps behind me, soft and steady, matching my pace. I took out my earbuds and glanced over my shoulder. The man from the bench was jogging a few yards behind me, still hooded, expression unreadable. My heart rate spiked, but I tried to keep my breathing even. Maybe he was just out for a run too. Still, it was unnerving. I picked up speed, but he did too. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I veered off the path toward an open field where a group of people sat scattered on picnic blankets. The man slowed, stopped at the edge of the field, and watched me cross to the other side. Relief flickered, But then I remembered my phone was still in my apartment. No way to call anyone if I got into trouble. I forced my legs to keep moving, looping back toward the park entrance. The street light at the corner flickered, buzzing with a high-pitched hum that made my skin crawl. The air smelled damp and sour, like wet leaves left to rot. From behind me, I heard a low chuckle. I froze mid-step. Turning slowly, I saw the man had moved onto the sidewalk, hands out of his pockets this time, swinging loosely by his sides. The hoodie was still up, but the dim light revealed a thin, angular face, pale against the dark fabric. His eyes caught the streetlight, glinting with something unreadable. "Hey," he said softly, voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, backing up. "I don't want any trouble." "Just walking," he said. "Didn't mean to scare you." My fingers itched to pull out my pepper spray, but I'd left it on the kitchen counter. It was stupid. I never thought I'd actually need it. I glanced around, just old houses, parked cars, no one else on the street. He took a step forward. I darted past him and broke into a run, heart hammering, lungs burning. The path to my building felt endless, shadows stretching tall against the dimming sky. I didn't look back until I was inside, door locked behind me with a click that sounded like a small victory. The hallway was dark and silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioner. I leaned against the door, trying to calm my ragged breath, fingers trembling. My phone was on the kitchen table, out of reach. I wished I had called the landlord to let me back in from work, or at least told someone where I was going. Minutes passed. The quietness pressed in, thick and heavy. Then, the faintest sound, the scrape of a shoe against the concrete outside, slow and deliberate. My heart seized. I crept to the peephole. No one there. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit by the emergency exit sign. Relief mixed with unease. Was I imagining it? Or was he still out there, watching, waiting? I locked the deadbolt and slid the chain across. I sat on the floor, back against the door, eyes fixed on the peephole. Every creak, every whisper of wind, made me jump. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself it was over. Maybe the man had given up, or maybe he hadn't meant anything sinister at all. But somewhere deep in my chest, a cold knot twisted tighter. I didn't sleep that night. The man's eyes haunted me, sharp and unreadable in the gloom of the park. And I knew if he wanted to, he could find me again. But for now, I was safe. At least until morning. Morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, but the dread hadn't lifted. I crept to the window, scanning the empty street. No sign of him. Yet the silence felt heavier now, as if the night had left something behind, something that wasn't quite gone. My phone buzzed. A message, just a single word. Waiting. I remember the way the streetlight flickered once as I locked the door behind me. It was just past 9, the kind of late spring evening when the air still held a faint chill, but the dark was settling in quickly, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The neighborhood was quiet. A few cars passed lazily, their headlights sweeping over the cracked sidewalks, and I could hear the faint hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block, though I hadn't seen a soul for a while. I'd had a long day at work, longer than usual, and all I wanted was to cook something simple and then crash in front of the TV. The apartment felt unusually cavernous that night, the silence pressing against the walls, making every creak and groan of the old building feel louder than it should. I set my keys down on the small table by the door and heard a faint shuffle somewhere in the hall outside my apartment. Maybe someone else returning home, I thought. Nothing to worry about. When I reached the kitchen, I noticed the window cracked open just a few inches. That was odd. I was sure I closed it before I left in the morning, but the night air was cool and damp, so I didn't think much of it. I shut the window firmly and pushed the latch home. A slight breeze stirred the curtains. The street lamp outside seemed to spot her again, casting uneven shadows into the room. I shrugged and turned on the stove. As I was chopping vegetables, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, a shadow slipping past the dirty window on the back door. My heart sped up. I froze, knife in hand, and listened. The building was so quiet I could hear the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, hesitant. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor walking their dog or someone coming home late. But the shadow had looked wrong, too deliberate, too careful, like it was trying not to be seen. I glanced at the door, felt a sudden tightness in my chest. I went back to the stove, trying to focus on dinner, but the unease lingered. I kept catching flashes of movement through the kitchen window, always outside, always just out of clear sight. When I finished cooking, I sat down at the small table by the window, the plate in front of me untouched. I stared outside, watching the street. Nothing. No cars, no people. Just the occasional flicker of light from the street lamp. Then the phone rang. I jumped, nearly spilling my food. It was a local number, one I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. Hello? Silence. I thought maybe the line was dead, but then I heard a faint breathing, shallow and uneven. I said, hello? Who is this? But the line went dead. I stared at the receiver, my pulse thumping in my ears. Whoever had called me wasn't trying to talk. It felt like a warning. I sat there for a long time, trying to tell myself it was nothing, just some kid messing around. But the way my skin prickled, the way I kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone to be there, that was new. After an hour, I told myself to get some fresh air. I locked the door behind me and stepped outside, heading for the small park a few blocks away. The night was darker than I'd expected, the street lamps farther apart than I'd remembered. As I walked, I noticed a man sitting on a bench, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap pulled low. He was alone, crouched forward, hands clasped between his knees. I passed without a glance, but after a few steps, I noticed him standing and following me at a distance. I quickened my pace, heart hammering. Each time I looked back, he stopped, acting as if he wasn't there, but I caught the outline of his figure slipping between patches of shadow. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, but the streets felt suddenly unfamiliar, the darkness heavier. When I reached the corner near my apartment, I ducked into a 24-hour convenience store, the harsh fluorescent light stabbing my eyes. I bought a bottle of water, trying to act casual, pretending I wasn't on edge. Outside, the man was nowhere to be seen. I exhaled slowly, told myself maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe he hadn't followed me after all. But when I turned back toward my building, I saw a figure standing across the street, half hidden in the shadow of an alley. He was watching me. I ran the rest of the way home, fumbling with my keys. Inside, I locked every door and window, sliding the deadbolt into place. My hands shook as I checked the locks twice. The phone was silent now, no calls. Hours later, I heard soft tapping at the back door, 3 quick knocks. I froze, sweat prickling down my back. I didn't recognize the sound as any knock I'd ever heard from a neighbor or delivery person. I ignored it, but the knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. Then a voice, low and gravelly, let me in. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind raced, thinking of ways to call for help, but my phone was in the other room. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of shuffling feet retreating into the night. I waited, breath shallow, until the darkness outside gave way to dawn. When the first light seeped through the curtains, I stepped outside cautiously. The back door was scratched near the latch. Someone had tried to force it. I called the police. They came, took notes, promised to patrol the area more frequently. But as they left, the officer said quietly, "You're lucky they didn't get in." That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows made me jump. The sense of safety I'd taken for granted was gone. The man was out there, somewhere close, watching, waiting. And I didn't know why. I didn't expect things to go wrong that night. Not really. I was just trying to get home after my late shift at the hospital, and the only thought I had on my mind was the pizza waiting in the fridge. The new place down the street, Marzano's, had a special on pepperoni, and I grabbed a couple of slices on the way out. It wasn't much, but after a 12-hour shift in the ER, it felt like a small luxury. The bus stop was less than a 5-minute walk from the hospital. Normally, I took a cab or an Uber, but the city had been so packed with events this week that the surge prices had doubled. Plus, the bus was almost empty at that time of night, and I liked the quiet solitude it offered, even if it wasn't the safest. I remember thinking the air was colder than usual that evening, the dampness and the wind that bit through my jacket. I could hear the crackling of dry leaves underfoot as I walked a short distance to the stop, alone except for a few stray cars idling at the traffic lights. The streets were mostly empty, aside from a couple of other pedestrians wrapped up in their own worlds, checking phones or rushing past with scarves pulled high. I arrived at the bus stop just as the bus was pulling in. I swiped my card, took the single seat near the back, and leaned my head against the window. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain-speckled glass. Everyone on the bus seemed tired like me, silent, eyes half closed, some nodding off. About 5 minutes into the ride, the bus stopped on a side street I didn't recognize. The driver looked up at the dark road ahead and muttered something under his breath, his hands tightening on the wheel. I glanced around. No one else moved. Then I noticed the man who had gotten on a few stops back. He was sitting just a couple of rows in front of me, and from the way he kept looking back over his shoulder, I guessed he was nervous. His clothes looked a little out of place, too layered for the weather, with a dark hoodie that shadowed most of his face. He was twitching, hands tapping on his knees like he was trying to stay calm, or maybe just restless. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the dull hum of the engine and the soft grind of the brakes. The bus jolted forward again, but then, unexpectedly, it slowed to a halt. The driver sighed, tapped a button to open the door, then shut it quickly. The man in front didn't get off. Instead, he suddenly stood up and walked toward me, his movements quick but oddly deliberate. I felt the blood drain from my face. Why was he coming this way? He stopped right beside my seat. "Hey," he said quietly, voice hoarse, "you got a minute?" My mind scrambled. Normally, I'd smile and nod, maybe make small talk. But something about him, the way his eyes darted, the tension in his posture, made my throat go dry. Yeah, I managed, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I lost my phone," he said, glancing nervously toward the driver, who seemed to be focused ahead, ignoring us. "Did you see it? Maybe dropped it in here?" The bus was nearly empty now, just a handful of passengers slumped in their seats, pretending not to notice. I shook my head. "No, sorry. I didn't see anything." He leaned closer, smell of something sharp and metallic hitting me. I realized then he hadn't showered in days, or maybe longer. The way he stared at me, unblinking, was unsettling. "Listen," he said, voice dropping lower, "if you see it, let me know. It's got some important stuff on it." I nodded, trying to keep calm. My fingers were trembling a little. The bus stopped again, this time in front of a dimly lit apartment building. He got off without another word, disappearing into the shadows before the doors closed. The bus rolled on. I tried to shake the unease but couldn't. Every few seconds I found myself glancing back, half expecting him to be there, leaning against the seat behind me, just watching. When we finally reached my stop, I stepped off quickly and walked briskly toward my apartment. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows. The late-night quiet felt too thick and too heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard footsteps behind me. I paused, heart thudding loud enough I was sure the person could hear it too. The footsteps slowed, then matched my pace. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking faster, pulling the door open and stepping inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, hands shaking. The sound of my own breathing filled the small hallway. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the faintest tapping on the other side of the door. I froze. The sound stopped. After a few more seconds, I turned the lock twice and stepped back, pressing my ear to the wood. No one was there. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every distant siren made me jump. I left a chair wedged beneath the doorknob, just in case. The next morning, I found a small slip of paper slipped under the door. No message. Just a thumbprint, smudged and dark, like someone had pressed a finger hard, then wiped it off. I called the police. They said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but without a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. I started carrying pepper spray in my bag and changed my routine, taking longer routes, staying under brighter lights. But the feeling stayed, the sensation of eyes watching, waiting. Like the bus ride wasn't over. Like the man hadn't really left. And when I glanced over my shoulder, sometimes I swore I saw a figure standing just beyond the streetlight's reach, too still to be anything but someone who didn't want to be seen. The night I decided to take the long way home from work was the night I realized how thin the line was between normal and chaos. I hadn't planned much beyond catching the 10:15 bus, like every Thursday, but that evening felt different from the moment I locked the office door behind me. The streets were quieter than usual, not the usual hum of the city, but a weight in the air, like the neighborhood had been holding its breath all day. I walked out of the building on 7th and Pine, keys rattling in my hand, the usual clack of my boots on the cracked pavement the only sound besides the distant hum of streetlights. The street lamps flickered off and on as I passed beneath them, giving the shadows a restless pulse. I didn't think much of it until I noticed the man sitting on the bench across the street. He was hunched over, wearing a dark jacket with the collar pulled up, his face mostly hidden in grease-streaked hands. He didn't move as I walked past, just stayed there, silent and still like a statue carved out of something angry and tired. I told myself he was homeless, or maybe just waiting for someone. The bus stop was right there. Plenty of people sat outside late. But as I moved on, the feeling that someone was watching me settled deep in my gut. I glanced back, and the man was gone. Odd, because the bench was right there. I was almost at the street corner when I heard footsteps behind me, light, deliberate, matching my pace. I didn't want to look, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled so sharply I had to. A slender figure was there, a few feet behind, walking with the uncanny stillness of someone who didn't want to be noticed. Their jacket was dark, too, but the hood was down, and in the dim streetlight, I caught a glimpse of a pale face, eyes that flicked toward me for a fraction of a second before looking away. I quickened my pace. So did they. My breath hitched, and I tried to keep calm. Maybe they were just headed home too, or another late-night worker. I could hear my shoes pounding against the uneven sidewalk, the uneven beat of my heart, the strangled sighs of passing cars that seemed miles away. At the bus stop, a flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly green glow. I pressed myself against the glass shelter, the cold sticking to my skin. The street behind me was empty, but the footsteps were growing louder, closer. I twisted my neck slightly, eyes scanning the street. There, about 20 yards back, the figure was walking faster now, their breathing audible even from this distance. I swallowed hard. The bus was late. The streetlights flickered again, a car passed by, headlights slicing the darkness. The stranger ducked into the shadows and disappeared. The bus screeched to a halt, doors opening with an pneumatic hiss. I stepped on, heart still hammering, clutching my bag tightly. The bus was nearly empty, and I chose a seat near the front, where the driver's rearview mirror reflected my pale, tense face. The vehicle lurched forward, and I exhaled the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But relief was short-lived. As the bus rolled through the empty streets, I caught sight in the window of the figure standing still on the corner where I'd been just moments before. They were watching the bus like a predator waiting for a chance. I turned away quickly, blinking hard to clear the vision. Maybe I was imagining it. The next stop was my neighborhood, a place I'd walked home from hundreds of times without a second thought. But tonight, the familiar streets felt alien. Shadows seemed to gather behind trees and alleyways. The faint rustle of leaves sounded like whispered warnings. I stepped off the bus at the corner of Elm and 12th, the cold night air biting into my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter, scanning the street before moving forward. The street was deserted except for a parked car with its engine running. I froze when I saw the driver's head swivel slightly in my direction as I passed. A sudden rustle from a nearby alley made me jump. I'd never been afraid of this neighborhood before. It was quiet enough during the day. But now, the silence was suffocating. I could feel eyes on me, tracking each step. I crossed to the other side of the street, increasing my pace, heart thrumming painfully. Then I heard it, the crunch of gravel behind me. Not the distant footsteps from before, but something heavier, slower, deliberate. I risked looking back. A man was trailing me, his shadow long under the sparse street lamps. I didn't recognize him, and the expression on his face was unreadable but tense. I broke into a jog. "Hey," he called out. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that made my blood freeze. "Wait." I didn't stop. The sound of his footsteps sped up, matching my own. I was running down the street now, the cold air burning my lungs, the fear twisting inside me like a living thing. Ahead, the street opened onto a small park. I ducked behind a row of bushes near the playground, trying to catch my breath, heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it. Seconds later, I heard him stop. A low curse slipped through the dark. Then the noises came, footsteps pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, the scrape of a shoe against concrete. I stayed still, clutching my phone in my pocket, fingers trembling. I wanted to call 911, but I was certain the signal would be weak here, and even if it wasn't, what good would it do if he caught me before help arrived? The minutes stretched endlessly. Then the man's footsteps receded. I waited another long minute before I dared to move, creeping out from behind the bushes and sprinting toward the street with more confidence than I felt. When I finally reached my apartment building, the door was locked. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them. A sharp click later, the door swung open, and I bolted inside, locking it behind me. I leaned against the door, breath ragged, skin cold and clammy. The silence inside was an impossible contrast to the night outside, but I didn't feel safe. Not yet. I peered through the peephole. The street was empty. No sign of him. Still, every creak from the old building made me jump. I checked the locks on the windows, the chains on the doors, my phone in my hand for the 100th time. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice before falling silent. I sat down on the floor, back against the door, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The terror hadn't left me, but at least for now, the immediate danger seemed over. But I knew deep down, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The night air was damp and sharp as I locked my car door behind me, the fluorescent lights of the parking lot flickering lazily above. I'd stayed late at the office, trying to finish the Henderson file before the weekend, but now the quiet was pressing in, heavy and unnatural. I glanced around the lot. Only a few cars remained, their owners long gone. The emptiness made my steps echo, the sound bouncing off the low brick buildings and the rows of leafless trees that lined the edges of the lot. I pulled my jacket tighter and headed toward the narrow sidewalk that led to the street, my heels clicking against cracked concrete. The street was mostly deserted, just a few taxis idling near the corner of 14th and Elm. I told myself I was imagining things, but I felt eyes on me, a prickling sensation crawling up my neck. The brisk wind carried something else, a faint, stale smell like something rotting, or maybe garbage left too long in the heat. It didn't fit the usual urban smells of exhaust and stale coffee. I swallowed hard, quickening my pace. I kept my phone in my palm, the screen dim but ready to light up at a moment's notice. The shortcut I usually took home through the alley between the laundromat and the dry cleaner suddenly felt wrong. I hesitated at the edge, looking down into the narrow passageway, its walls coated with grimy graffiti and streaks of rust where rainwater had slipped down. The alley smelled worse than the street, a sour, metallic stench. I debated taking the long route, doubling back to the main roads, but the thought of adding another 20 minutes to my walk home made me shiver. I told myself the alley was fine. I'd taken it 100 times before. The clack of a loose brick shifting under my heel made me jump, heart thudding. Halfway through the alley, I heard it, the faint scrape of rubber on concrete, too subtle to be a passing bicycle or a cart. I froze, tilting my head. The sound came again, from behind me. I swallowed and forced myself to keep walking, eyes starting to each shadow, every darker corner. My breath came quicker, the cold now feeling like it was seeping into my bones. Ahead, the alley opened onto a narrow, dimly lit street. I stepped out and forced myself to look back. There, just at the mouth of the alley, a figure stood still, half hidden behind the dumpster. The silhouette was too broad to be a woman. The man wore a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, his face obscured. My throat tightened. I didn't dare stop or call out. Instead, I turned and kept walking briskly. The streetlights flickered overhead, and the sidewalks were slick with recent rain. The man stayed where he was, unmoving. The hair on my arms stood up, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I crossed to the other side of the street, my eyes now searching every dark doorway and parked car. I noticed a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and mechanical, coming from down the block. I paused, listening. It was the sound of a tapping flashlight against metal, or maybe a knife against a window frame. I couldn't be sure. I kept moving, my feet pounding faster now, echoing in the empty streets. My phone buzzed suddenly in my pocket. I fumbled it out, heart in my throat. It was a text from an unknown number, going home late. I stared at it, the words sending a fresh wave of unease through me. I didn't respond. Instead, I quickened my pace toward the busier intersection a few blocks ahead. The streetlights here were brighter, the open cafes still humming with life, people chatting and drinking at tables outside. I breathed out slowly, trying to calm the rapid beating of my heart. Maybe the figure in the alley was just a homeless man, or someone waiting for a ride. The text could have been a prank or some dumb joke. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. I decided to buy a coffee from the corner cafe, telling myself the warmth and company would steady me. Inside, the smell of strong espresso and baked pastries hit me like a wave. The barista, a young woman with a nose ring, smiled and handed me my cup without asking questions. I took a seat by the window, the streetlight outside casting long, uneven shadows across the sidewalk. I sipped the bitter coffee, scanning the street through the glass. Across from the cafe, a man sat alone on a bench, hunched forward, his hood pulled tight over his head. The way he shifted his gaze toward me in quick, sharp glances made my skin crawl. I debated leaving right then, but my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. My eyes whitened. It was me walking down the alley just minutes ago, captured from behind. The angle was unmistakable, the familiar outline of my jacket and the curve of my ponytail. I felt my fingers tremble. Who could have taken that? I looked up quickly, scanning the street. The man on the bench was gone. The cafe's door chimed as a new customer came in, but my mind was racing, all the small, scattered pieces clicking into place. Someone had been following me, watching me. I left the cafe hurriedly, the night suddenly feeling colder, the shadows deeper. I stayed on the well-lit main roads, eyes flicking constantly to the windows of closed shops, the few pedestrians walking by. Still, the feeling of being hunted clung to me like a second skin. When I finally reached my front door, I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. I glanced over my shoulder once more before stepping inside and bolting the door behind me. The silence of my apartment was both a relief and a new kind of terror. I checked every lock, every window latch. Then I noticed a small envelope slipped under the door. I picked it up with numb fingers, the paper heavy and rough. Inside was a single card, plain and typed, "See you tomorrow." My breath caught. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in with invisible pressure. I was now alone, and whatever this was had only just begun. Story 5, Midnight Mile of No Return. The night was colder than I expected when I set out, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones through the thin fabric of your jacket and the car's drafty windows. I had left the city behind after dinner, the streets thinning out into long stretches of highway framed by dense trees and patches of scrubland. My destination was a small town about 2 hours away, somewhere I hadn't been since I was a kid. I told myself it was just a drive, a way to clear my head after a rough week. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than that. I remember the dashboard clock flicked to 11:07 p.m. when I passed the last gas station. I'd filled the tank earlier, but the pump there was the only real sign of life for miles ahead. The road ahead was a ribbon of asphalt lit only by my headlights and the orange glow of a few scattered street lamps. Beyond that, the world was swallowed in darkness. The radio was off. I preferred to listen to the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of tires on gravel or broken pavement. About 30 minutes into the drive, I passed a small side road that plunged into the woods. The trees arched overhead like a tunnel, their branches scratching against each other in a way that reminded me of fingernails on a chalkboard. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing there, just at the edge of the tree line, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. I chalked it up to tired eyes and maybe a trick of the shadows. Night drives had a way of making the mind reach, pulling shapes out of darkness where none existed. The moon was a sliver, barely illuminating the road. That stretch of highway was straight and lonely, the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. I kept my speed steady, around 60 miles per hour, watching the road carefully in the mirrors for anything unusual. That's when I noticed the headlights behind me. At first, I thought it was just a single car on the same route, probably a late traveler like myself. But as the minutes passed, those lights didn't change lanes or pass. They stayed exactly the same distance behind, persistent and unwavering. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. Maybe the driver was just cautious, or maybe they were lost, following me by accident. I flipped on the rearview mirror's night mode and tried to get a better look. The headlights were bright, but I couldn't see any other details, no taillights, no sign of the car's shape. It was as if the headlights were just floating or fixed in place. The thought sent a chill through me. I took a deep breath and glanced down at my phone. No signal. Typical for this stretch of highway. I had no way to call anyone if I needed help. I considered pulling over, letting the car pass, but the last turnout was a mile back. I kept driving and watched the headlights from the corner of my eye. Suddenly, the car behind flickered in and out. The headlights dimmed, then brightened again, as if someone were playing with the switch. I blinked hard, trying to focus, but the effect was unnerving. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I felt like I was being toyed with, like the car behind me knew I was watching and was trying to unsettle me. I passed a curve in the road and saw the glint of something metallic on the shoulder. A rusted old guardrail, battered and dented. Just beyond it, the forest thickened, shadows pooling between the trunks of the trees. That's when I saw it, just for a heartbeat, a figure standing at the edge of the road. Not a person, really. More like a silhouette with limbs that seemed just a little too long, a shadow twisted out of shape. It wasn't moving, but it looked directly at me. My heart thudded so loudly I was sure the car behind me could hear it. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, pushing the car faster, trying to close the distance to the town. The headlights in the mirror stayed with me, unwavering still. I glanced to the side again, but the figure had vanished. The road ahead was empty, except for the occasional sign warning of deer crossings or sharp turns. I kept my eyes glued to the road, hands gripping the wheel too tightly. Every so often, the headlights behind me blinked off completely and then back on. Each time, I felt a rush of panic that threatened to take over. At one point, I caught movement along the roadside. A deer, or maybe more than one, stepping out from the trees. I slowed down a little, wary of a sudden collision. The animals froze in place, eyes shining in my headlights, then darted back into the forest. Among them, I thought I saw the silhouette again, but this time it seemed more distorted, like a trick of the corner of my vision. My breathing became uneven. I told myself it was just exhaustion, the strain of the drive and the late hour making my imagination run wild. But the presence behind me was undeniably real, even if I couldn't make out its form. It was there, following, watching. 3 miles from the town, the highway narrowed, forcing 2 cars to slow and pass carefully. I used the opportunity to glance behind me quickly as another vehicle passed. The headlights that had been dogging me had disappeared. For a moment, relief washed over me, but it was fragile and fleeting. Then, as I reached the town's outskirts, the radio crackled to life with static, then a faint voice, so faint I wasn't sure I heard it at first. It sounded like someone whispering my name. I jerked the dial, trying to find a station, but the voice faded away, swallowed by the static. I parked outside a small diner that was still open, its neon sign buzzing softly in the cool night. As I stepped out of the car, the silence of the town felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. I looked back down the highway, half expecting to see those headlights reappear. There was nothing but darkness stretching into the trees. Inside the diner, the few customers glanced up at me curiously. I ordered coffee and tried to steady my racing heart. I kept replaying the drive in my mind, the persistent car behind me, the shadow figures, the whisper over the radio. What had I really been chasing on that dark highway? And what, if anything, had been chasing me? I didn't know yet, but I had the feeling that this night was far from over. The highway stretched ahead in a narrow ribbon of asphalt, swallowed on either side by dense forest that pressed in like dark sentinels. I kept my eyes on the road, but the streetlights were sparse, flickering intermittently, casting long, uneven shadows that danced just out of reach. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as the engine droned behind me. There was a silence beyond the drone, a kind of thick stillness that settled around the car, pressing against the windows. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been tightening in my chest since I left the last town, but the more I tried, the stronger it became. It had been late when I started this leg of the trip, too late to see much more than the silhouette of trees and the occasional deer darting across the road. The miles behind me felt like they belonged to someone else, to a version of me who hadn't noticed the subtle changes creeping in. At first, it was just the way the road curved a little too sharply in places, the way the streetlights failed to appear when I expected them, or how the radio station kept cutting out, replaced by static and faint, unintelligible murmurs. I chalked it up to poor reception, but the static seemed to linger longer than it should, almost as if it were holding on to something. I glanced into the rearview mirror. The headlights behind me were there, a pair of red dots in the dark, persistent and steady. I hadn't expected anyone else on this stretch of road at this hour, but the lights remained. Sometimes they seemed closer, sometimes farther away, but never gone. The road ahead curved again, and the headlights followed. I wondered if the driver was just taking the same route, or if it was something more deliberate. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I reached down and turned the radio off, preferring the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind outside. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and I felt like I was the only living thing moving through that frozen space. The darkness outside the windows wasn't empty, it felt full, as if there were eyes watching from the shadows, waiting for me to slip up. The thought was ridiculous, I told myself. But still, I checked the rearview mirror again. The lights hadn't moved. They weren't speeding up or slowing down. Just following, steady and unblinking. Every now and then, a sign appeared along the side of the road, a marker for the next town, a warning about wildlife, a mile count. Usually, they were faded and worn, the paint peeling, but tonight they seemed sharper, almost freshly painted, as though someone was making sure they were visible. On one sign, something about the name caught my eye. Not the name itself, but the way it was written. The letters looked smudged, uneven, as if someone had tried to alter it, and then stopped halfway through. I blinked and looked away quickly, not wanting to dwell on it. I tried to focus on my breathing, slow and even, but the tightness in my chest wouldn't loosen. My vision blurred suddenly, and I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was just fatigue. I'd been driving for hours. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I should have stopped to rest, but the idea of pulling over felt wrong. Like giving up, or inviting something inside. The headlights behind me flashed once, just a quick burst, and then went back to their dull glow. I blinked, heart pounding, and instinctively pressed the accelerator a little harder. The car surged forward, eating up the miles faster, but the lights didn't fall back. They stayed there, steady. I passed a turnoff for a small town I'd never heard of. The sign said Haven's End. The name was ironic, or maybe just cruel. I had no intention of stopping there, but the thought of a town named like that sent my mind spiraling. What kind of place had a name like that? I imagined empty streets and boarded-up windows, and a silence so thick you could hear your own heartbeat echoing against the walls. The road ahead straightened out for a while, and I relaxed just a little. The headlights remained behind, but they didn't feel as oppressive. I told myself I was imagining things, that the fatigue was playing tricks on me. But then the car's temperature gauge ticked up suddenly, climbing higher and higher. The heat warning light blinked on. I fought the urge to panic. That was the last thing I needed, my car breaking down in the middle of nowhere, with who knows what lurking outside. I pulled off to the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the tires. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the car's cooling hiss, the steady pulse of my own breathing. The headlights were still there, in the mirror, parked a little ways behind me now. I couldn't see the driver, but the car's shape was clear in the faint moonlight. A dark sedan, the kind you could see in any city, but here it felt alien. I debated whether to get out and look under the hood, but the thought of stepping into the forest was worse. The trees swayed softly, casting long, skeletal shadows. I locked the doors and sat back, trying to steady my nerves. Then I heard it. A soft tapping on the driver's side window. My heart leapt into my throat. I didn't move at first, frozen by the sound. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate, a rhythm that felt almost like a warning. I swallowed hard and turned my head slowly toward the window. The face that looked back at me was pale, eyes dark and unblinking. The figure was a man, but there was something wrong with him, like he belonged to a different world, or a nightmare I hadn't dreamed yet. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the pounding of my heart. I pressed the lock button again, harder this time. The tapping stopped. The man stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the night like a ghost. I sat there trembling, the silence pressing down again. The headlights behind me flickered and then vanished. I blinked, heart racing, and checked the road ahead. Nothing but darkness. The car's temperature gauge dropped back to normal, and I took a shaky breath. I didn't want to drive, but staying there felt worse. I started the engine, the familiar rumble a small comfort, and pulled back onto the road. For the next few miles, I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. Nothing appeared behind me. No headlights. No shadows. But the feeling didn't leave. It clung to me, a weight on my chest, a whisper in the dark. I realized then that the night was far from over, and the road I was on might not lead anywhere safe at all. The road stretched out before me like a dark ribbon, narrowing and twisting through the wooded hills. My headlights cut a thin swath of white into the night, but beyond that, it was a void. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the knuckles on my right hand pale under the pressure. The unease, that oppressive weight from earlier, had not eased. Instead, it had settled into something colder, more stubborn, like a shadow refusing to leave. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The highway behind me was empty, the faint glimmer of a distant taillight having flickered out miles back. There was no one on this stretch, not a car, not a flicker of movement. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches scraping against the black sky. I thought about stopping somewhere, anywhere, to rest, to shake this feeling, but the last town was hours back, and I was barely halfway to the city ahead. The gas gauge hovered just above empty, and I knew the next station was miles down the road. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the tires against the asphalt, the steady hum of the engine. My mind kept drifting back to the stories I'd heard growing up, drivers who'd vanished, strange hitchhikers who appeared out of nowhere, and the fog that sometimes rolled in and swallowed cars whole. It was easy to dismiss those tales as campfire nonsense, but now, under this heavy night sky, with nothing but the road and my own thoughts, they felt unnervingly real. A sudden movement caught my eye, a flash of something white between the trees on the right. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart slammed against my ribs. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe the moon reflecting off a stray piece of litter or a bird's wing. But the knot in my stomach tightened. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I slowed the car to 35 miles an hour, a crawl in this part of the night. The air inside the cabin grew colder, and I reached for the heater, but the dial stuck halfway between off and low. The windows fogged slightly with my breath, making the world outside look distorted and dreamlike. The trees blurred and shifted, leaning closer to the road as if trying to peer inside my car. Then I heard it, a soft tapping sound against the passenger window. My head snapped to the side, eyes searching the darkness beyond the glass. There was nothing. No branch, no animal, no person. Just a void. My mouth went dry. The tapping came again, more insistent this time, like the delicate fingers of someone trying to get my attention without startling me. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. I was tired, probably more than I realized, and the isolation was playing tricks on me. I rolled the window down a crack, letting in the cool night air. The smell was sharp, earthy, damp with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic that I couldn't place. "Hello?" I called out, voice cracking. The sound felt loud and harsh in the stillness. No reply. The tapping stopped. I took a deep breath and pulled the window back up. The heater suddenly kicked in, humming quietly. The chill retreated, but the sensation of being watched remained. I told myself to focus on the road, to keep driving. Minutes passed. The trees seemed to thin, the road straightened out. I allowed myself a brief moment of relief. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights caught a figure standing at the side of the highway, about 50 yards ahead. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that fluttered in the breeze, or maybe it was the night air itself moving in strange currents. He stood perfectly still, staring at me as I approached. There was something off about his posture, the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if burdened by something invisible. I slowed again, the urge to stop clawing at me. But the rational part of my mind screamed no. Who knew if this guy was stranded or dangerous? I'd seen too many stories about people picked up by strangers who turned out to be trouble. Yet, the man lifted one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I glanced at the fuel gauge, half a tank. I could make it to the next station without a stop. I told myself to keep going. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was failing some unspoken test by ignoring him. My grip on the wheel loosened for a fraction of a second, and when I looked up again, the man was gone. Gone. Just like that. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. The car skidded slightly before coming to a stop in the middle of the lane. I stared ahead, breath misting in the cold air, but the roadside was empty, no sign of the man, no footprints or disturbed leaves. I reached over and unlocked the doors, my fingers trembling. The radio crackled to life on its own, loud static filling the cabin before cutting out. I slammed the volume down and turned the dial, hoping for a station, anything but silence. A voice flickered through for a moment, faint and distorted. "Don't stop." The words barely audible, but clear enough to send a fresh wave of panic through me. I spun the dial again, but there was only static now. The heater sputtered and died, plunging the car into a cold stillness. I leaned back against the seat, heart hammering. The road ahead was empty, the trees standing like silent watchers. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The night was no longer just dark, it was hostile. I forced myself to start the engine again, hands shaking. The car roared to life, lights piercing the darkness once more. I took a deep breath and eased back onto the road. As I drove, I kept glancing through the side windows, half expecting to see something move just beyond the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. Just the steady pulse of asphalt beneath the tires and the empty road stretching ahead. Still, the sense of being followed clung to me, growing stronger with every mile. The man, the tapping, the voice on the radio, they weren't figments of exhaustion or loneliness. They were warnings. Warnings I wished I had heeded. The night had only just begun. The highway stretched ahead, the dull glow of my headlights cutting through the thick blanket of night. I kept my eyes glued to the road, but the ache in my chest wouldn't let me relax. The radio murmured soft static between songs I couldn't quite place, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled like a warning. I hadn't spoken since the driver's seat had become my lonely refuge hours ago. I told myself that I only needed to reach the next town, where the gas station sign flickered faintly like a beacon. But the road behind me felt heavier with every mile, as if I was dragging something that didn't want to be left behind. I had tried to shake the feeling earlier, the unease that crept up the moment I passed that twisted junction. There was nothing there, really, just a worn-down exit sign for a long-abandoned rest stop. Yet, the second I crossed the intersection, my eyes caught movement in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a cluster of trees swaying in the wind. But when the shape solidified, I recognized it, A car, black as pitch, trailing me just far enough to seem casual but close enough to be deliberate. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I glanced into the mirror again, and the headlights behind me were steady, unwavering. I switched lanes, then blinked and saw the car do the same. At 4 in the morning, on a deserted stretch of highway, this didn't make sense. I wasn't speeding or driving erratically. So why was someone following me? I resisted the urge to slam the brakes. That would only confirm whatever their intent was. Instead, I focused on keeping calm and considered my options. The next town was still miles ahead, but there were smaller junctions along the way that could offer a way out, either a service road or a place crowded enough to lose a tail. But as the distance between me and the mysterious car barely changed, my hope thinned. Tapping the horn a couple of times felt pointless. The car remained there, unwavering. I even tried switching the radio station abruptly, but the car's headlights stayed locked on me. It was as if the driver was mirroring my every move, waiting for me to make a mistake. The isolation of the route gnawed at me. I remembered the stories I'd heard about night drives, the ones about travelers who saw figures standing in the median or shadowed passengers appearing in the back seat, tales that made you question your own senses. I laughed bitterly at myself for feeling like I was starring in one of those stories. Logic told me that no one was following me for anything sinister. Maybe a drunk driver, or someone lost. But then the car's headlights dipped briefly, and I saw it, a figure behind the windshield, face obscured by darkness, watching me. Something in the set of those eyes made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the road ahead. I reached for my phone in the console, but the screen blinked empty, no signal. I wasn't surprised. This stretch of highway had always been a dead zone. Panic began to rise like bile in my throat. The road twisted again, carving along the side of a hill, and I hugged the curve tightly. The black car stayed on my tail, but now, for the first time, it slowed down. I willed myself to keep going, but curiosity gnawed at me. What was the driver's game? Did they want to scare me? Or something worse? Suddenly, the vehicle's headlights flashed rapidly 3 times, like a signal. I nearly lost control. I forced myself to pull over into a small turnout just beyond the curve. The gravel crunched under my tires as I stopped, heart pounding. My breath came in shallow gasps. The car slowed to a stop behind me, its engine idling low. From my vantage point, I could see the driver's side window roll down. A man's silhouette appeared, his face still unreadable in the low light. "Need a hand?" His voice was calm, unnervingly so. I hesitated, weighing every instinct. Something about his tone didn't match the situation. I shook my head, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "No, thank you. Just resting." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned the headlights off, and the world around us plunged into blackness. The only sound was the wind threading through the scattered trees lining the roadside. I tried to think of an excuse to leave, but before I could, the man's voice came again, softer this time. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No," I admitted cautiously. "Neither am I." The silence stretched. Then, without warning, his door opened. I tensed, ready to bolt, but he stepped out calmly and walked to the trunk of his car. He popped it open, revealing a flashlight and what looked like a road map. "You ever get lost out here, it's easy to lose more than your way," he said, shining the beam across the ground. "Thanks, but I'll be fine." I forced a laugh, but it was hollow. He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He closed the trunk and hesitated, then looked directly at me. "You're driving toward Raven's Hollow, right?" I blinked, surprised. "Yeah. How did you know that?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just a guess. Not many take this road at this hour. The name Raven's Hollow sent a cold shiver down my spine. I'd heard stories about that place, stories that made it sound like a ghost town swallowed by the forest, a place where things didn't stay buried. I'm just passing through, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded again, then stepped back toward his car. Safe travels. The window rolled back up, the engine rumbled to life, and in a moment, the black car was gone. I sat there for a long time after, the dark pressing in from every side. The road felt emptier now, as if something had been waiting for me and now watched from the shadows. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, I didn't glance into the mirror. I didn't want to see if the car had returned. But the road ahead was endless, and I was still running from whatever waited just beyond the edge of the night. The road stretched endlessly before me, a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt slicing through the dense forest like a scar. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the steering wheel, the hum of the engine my only companion. The headlights cut through the thick fog that had settled in since dusk, but the beam only seemed to swallow the mist, creating the illusion of driving into a void. Somewhere behind me, the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The miles had dragged past without change, the monotony broken only by the occasional flash of a reflective road sign or the faint glimmer of a window light in some far-off cabin. Yet, the stillness of the night pressed against me with tangible weight. I told myself it was just the isolation, the dark playing tricks on my mind. But the unease gnawed at me, persistent and relentless. About an hour ago, I'd passed that old gas station on Route 47, the one with the peeling paint and the flickering neon sign that read open 24 hours even though the place looked abandoned. I remembered the stories I'd heard about that stretch of highway, tales whispered by locals about drivers who vanished without a trace, or worse, who'd encountered strange, silent figures standing at the roadside. I'd scoffed at the time, but now, sitting alone with only the sound of my own breathing and the engine's drone, I wasn't so sure. My mind began to churn over those stories, each one more unsettling than the last. The way the headlights sometimes caught fleeting shapes behind the trees, or how some travelers claimed their radios would crackle with static and faint voices calling their names. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping dread. There was no one out here but me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A sudden movement caught my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the car skidded to a halt. For a moment, I stared at the figure, frozen in place. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that blended seamlessly with the shadows. His face was obscured by the brim of a hat, but I could sense his gaze locked onto me. "Hey," I said, voice shaking despite myself. "Do you need help?" He didn't respond. Instead, he began to walk alongside the car, matching my pace as I slowly rolled forward. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I considered rolling down the window but hesitated, the stories flooding back. What if this was one of those restless spirits, or worse? The man's presence was oppressive, and I realized I could barely hear the engine anymore, as if the night had swallowed every sound except the soft crunch of his footsteps on gravel. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see him disappear, but he was still there, steadfast and silent. Panic surged through me. I pressed the accelerator, the car lurching forward, but the man kept pace effortlessly. I wasn't sure if I was outrunning him or if the darkness was playing with my perception. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, unchanging, and the fog thickened, wrapping around the trees like a suffocating blanket. In the distance, I spotted the faint glow of another gas station. Relief flooded me, and I headed toward it, hoping to find someone, anyone, to explain what was happening. The man beside me stopped abruptly, as if realizing I was no longer within reach. I risked a glance back. He was gone. The fog had swallowed him whole. I pulled into the gas station parking lot, the harsh fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the enveloping darkness outside. The place was deserted, shelves dust-covered and long forgotten. I stepped out of the car, heart hammering, and scanned the lot. No sign of a man. Just as I turned back toward my car, the radio crackled to life behind me, static giving way to a faint whisper. I froze, every instinct screaming to run. The whisper grew clearer, words forming in a voice that was both chilling and familiar. Don't look back. I didn't. Driving away from that gas station, the road ahead blurred through my tears. Whatever haunted this night, this highway, I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. The words echoed in my mind, cold and deliberate. Don't look back. But the urge gnawed at me like a ravenous animal, desperate for release. The headlights behind me blurred and flickered, not another car, but something else. Shadows contorted at the edge of the road, shifting against the dark trees lining the highway. I gripped the wheel tighter, breath shallow, heart drumming against my ribs as if warning me to stop. The radio sputtered again, static bleeding into a low, guttural hum that thrummed through the dashboard. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, promising myself just one glance. The mirror reflected only darkness, save for two pinpoint lights hovering or watching. The whisper returned, this time closer, more urgent, you can't leave. I slammed my foot down, tires screaming against the asphalt. The highway stretched endlessly, but the oppressive weight in the air pressed down harder with every mile. Behind me, that presence lingered, a relentless predator stalking its prey, reminding me that some roads don't lead away, they lead deeper into the nightmare. Story 6, Beacon of the Drowned Light. I never thought a place like that could exist, right there on the edge of the world, where the land crumbles into the relentless gray sea. The lighthouse stood alone on the cliff, its paint peeling and glass panes cracked, battered by decades of wind and salt. It had been abandoned for years, a forgotten relic no one seemed to care about except me, for reasons I couldn't fully explain at first. I had taken the job as the lighthouse's caretaker during one of those moments when I needed to disappear. The past months had been a blur of noise and regret, and the thought of isolation among the wild waves seemed like a chance to recalibrate, to find some semblance of peace. The owner, a distant man named Hargrove, had made the arrangement cheaply, emphasizing that it needed only basic upkeep. No visitors were expected. No one would come near. On my first day, I arrived by a battered old Jeep, driving slowly along the narrow dirt road that loomed precariously close to the cliff's edge. The wind was sharp, carrying an ironic chill despite the early summer season. The sky was a heavy blanket of gray, the kind that presses down on your chest if you stay outside too long. I climbed the stairs that led up to the lighthouse door, already feeling the way the building seemed to breathe like a living thing long neglected. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and the smell of rust and old wood. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots as I explored. The spiral staircase curled upward, each step shrouded in shadows. The lantern room at the top was coated with a thin layer of grime but still housed a massive Fresnel lens, an intricate assembly of glass and metal that once cast light for miles. I ran my hand along its cold surface, feeling the weight of years pressing down. That night, the wind howled, rattling the windows and making the entire tower groan. I had set up my cot in the small, cramped living quarters on the ground level. The place was sparse: a stove, a chair, a table with a single lamp, and a shelf with a few books and a notebook the previous caretaker had left behind. I flipped through the notebook, reading faint, hurried entries about the weather and equipment checks, but nothing that hinted at what I was about to discover. As darkness swallowed the coastline, I sat by the window, watching the sea churn in the moonlight. The lighthouse, even in its neglect, stood as a sentinel against the chaos below. I felt a strange kinship with it, the way it endured, solitary, facing the relentless forces of nature. But then, at some point, the silence began to warp. It started subtly, with sounds I tried to dismiss as the house settling or the wind playing tricks. A faint scraping from the staircase, like nails dragging across wood. A soft whisper, barely perceptible, as if someone was speaking from just beyond the walls. At first, I blamed the isolation and my tired mind. I reminded myself I was alone. There was no one else. But then I heard footsteps. They came from above, slow and deliberate, pacing the spiraled stairs to the lantern room. The sound echoed hollowly, bouncing down through the shaft. My heart thudded in my chest. I forced myself to stand, gripping the railing as I climbed. At the top, I found the room empty, save for the flickering lamp I had left on the floor. No sign of anyone else. The door to the catwalk outside was closed and locked. I went back down, telling myself it was a trick of the wind, or my imagination conjuring company from loneliness. Yet even as I lay on my cot, the feeling of being watched prickled my skin. The next day, I explored the grounds around the lighthouse. The cliff was jagged, slippery with moss and salt residue, and the sea below crashed with a ferocity that seemed almost alive. I found remnants of what looked like an old campsite, a faded tarp tied to a tree, rusted cooking utensils buried in the dirt. Nobody had been here recently, but the traces suggested someone had been. That evening, as the storm rolled in, the atmosphere shifted. The wind screamed through cracks and broken panes, and the lighthouse shook as if caught in a giant's grip. I sat near the fireplace, the flames sputtering against the damp air, trying to calm my nerves. Then, a low, guttural sound rose from below, like metal scraping against stone. I froze. The sound grew louder, more insistent. My eyes darted to the spiral staircase, shadows pooling at its base. The scraping turned into a slow, dragging noise, something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. I grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the stairs, the beam cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, the light caught a figure, a man, hunched and soaked from the storm, his clothes tattered and face smudged with dirt. I blinked, but he vanished. One moment he was there, the next, gone. I stumbled back, heart racing, the beam of my flashlight swinging wildly. Outside, thunder rolled, and lightning flashed, illuminating that empty doorway again and again. And then, just as suddenly, silence swallowed the noise. I locked the door and bolted it, my back pressed against the cold wood. The flashlight flickered and died. I was left in the black, hearing only the storm and my own ragged breathing. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak and groan seemed magnified, every gust of wind a whispered warning. I thought about leaving, driving back down the cliff road to the town below. But something held me there, an almost magnetic pull, like the lighthouse itself was drawing me in. I caught myself staring at the glass of the lantern room, where the great Fresnel lens stood mute and still. I wondered what the light had seen in all those years before it was extinguished. Ships lost at sea, storms raging, men fighting the dark. And now, I was the only one left to watch. I didn't yet understand the true weight of that responsibility. Not until the nights began to stretch longer, and the shadows grew deeper. Not until the whispers became voices, and the silence broke. But that was all ahead. For now, I was just a man alone with the sea and a lighthouse that refused to die. The morning light spilled hesitantly through the narrow window of the lighthouse keeper's quarters, casting long, pale shadows across the cramped room. I woke with a start, heart pounding, the echo of last night's strange sounds still lingering in my mind. I rubbed my eyes and sat up on the edge of the rickety cot, the wooden floor creaking beneath my weight. The lighthouse felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of something unspeakable. Yesterday's events played over again in my head, the sudden blackout, the strange whispering that had seemed to drift through the air like a fog, and the inexplicable tug that pulled me toward the light chamber. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important, some detail that might explain the growing honeys clawing at my chest. I dressed quickly in the faded flannel shirt and worn jeans I'd brought with me. The wind outside rattled the window panes, a constant reminder of the ocean's relentless presence. Pulling on my boots, I made my way to the narrow spiral staircase. The metal steps were slick with salt and old rust, and I gripped the railing tighter than necessary to steady myself. The light chamber loomed above, its glass panels smeared with grime and salt spray. From up here, the view was both breathtaking and terrifying, the endless expanse of gray water stretching to the horizon, waves crashing against jagged rocks below. The lighthouse stood isolated, perched on the edge of a jagged cliff, a solitary sentinel against the vast, indifferent sea. I reached the top and pushed open the heavy door, the hinges groaning in protest. The large Fresnel lens stood at the center, a complex structure of glass and metal that once cast a powerful beam to warn ships away from the deadly shoreline. Now, it sat silent, dark, and unlit. I ran a hand over the cool metal, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. Something was off. The lens should have been spotless, maintained regularly by the previous keeper. But now, a thin layer of dust and salt had settled on the glass, as if the place had been abandoned for weeks rather than days. I swallowed hard and began inspecting the control panel. The switches and dials were coated in grime, but otherwise intact. I flipped the main power switch, and the room hummed as the machinery came to life. The light flickered weakly, then steadied, casting a faint glow through the fog pressing against the windows. I watched as the beam swept slowly over the water, illuminating the swirling mist below. The moment was strangely comforting, a reminder of order in the chaos. Yet, beneath that comfort, a strange tension gnawed at my stomach. I felt as though something unseen was watching me from the shadows beyond the glass. I stepped back and surveyed the room, searching for clues to explain the strange atmosphere. The old logbook lay on a dusty shelf nearby. With some effort, I pulled it down and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was neat and precise, dated entries chronicling weather reports, supply deliveries, and light maintenance. But as I turned further, the entries grew sparse, then stopped altogether 2 months ago. I frowned and continued reading. The last few notes were terse and cryptic, mentions of unusual noises, unexplained shadows, and a feeling of being watched. My pulse quickened. No previous keeper had ever reported anything like this. Had they abandoned the post because of fear? Or was there something darker at play? The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the windows more forcefully. I pulled the door shut against the cold gust and descended the staircase, the eerie silence of the lighthouse pressing in around me. Back in the living quarters, I opened the creaking front door and stepped outside. The cliff's edge was just a few feet away, the jagged rocks below battered by restless waves. The air smelled of salt, seaweed, and something faintly metallic like blood. I wandered along the narrow path that circled the lighthouse, crunching over gravel and broken shells. The fog thickened, swallowing the horizon and muffling the crash of the surf. I paused near an old weathered bench, tracing the carved initials that someone had left decades ago. The loneliness here was palpable, a silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. As I turned to head back inside, a faint sound caught my attention, a scraping, like fingernails dragged slowly across stone. I froze, heart hammering, eyes scanning the fog for the source. The sound was gone, replaced by the relentless wind and the distant call of a gull. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. That evening, I lit a small kerosene lamp and sat at the scratched wooden table, hoping light might keep the shadows at bay. I spread out the sparse supplies I'd found in the kitchen, a tin of stale biscuits, a half-emptied bottle of water, and a rusted can of beans. The meager meal did little to quell the gnawing unease. I found myself drawn back to the logbook. By flickering lamplight, I scanned the entries again, this time focusing on the names of the previous keepers. One stood out, Thomas Grady. His last entry was dated exactly 2 months ago. The note was chilling. Voices come with the fog. They call my name. I see shapes in the glass, faces that shouldn't be there. I fear what I don't understand. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Could Thomas have been the source of the strange noises I'd heard? Or had something followed him here, lurking unseen? Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the base of the lighthouse. I jumped, nearly knocking over the lamp. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. Another thud. Then silence. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and crept to the door. The wind had died down, and the fog had thinned slightly, revealing the rocky ground below. I scanned the area carefully, but saw nothing unusual. As I turned back inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the fog, a fleeting shadow that vanished as I blinked. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but the knot in my stomach tightened. That night, sleep eluded me. The walls seemed to close in, and every creak or groan of the old building set my nerves on edge. I lay awake, listening to the wind and the distant crash of waves, waiting for dawn to break and bring with it some measure of clarity. Before I drifted off, I swore I heard a whisper, barely audible, carried on the breeze, my name. The fog clung to the cliffs like a living thing, thick enough to swallow the sound of my footsteps as I climbed the narrow path back toward the lighthouse. The cold stone beneath my fingers was slick with moisture, and a salty chill seemed to seep into my bones with every breath. I tried to steady my nerves, telling myself that what I'd seen below was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the waves or some piece of debris caught in the water. But the unease that had settled in my chest refused to budge. Earlier that day, I had arrived at the lighthouse with a mix of resolve and curiosity. The place had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last keeper vanished without a trace. Locals whispered about strange happenings, flickering lights at odd hours, disembodied voices on the wind, but I had chosen to ignore the warnings. I was a writer, after all, chasing stories that felt more real than the dull routine of my town. I wanted to see the lighthouse up close, to feel its history in my hands, to uncover whatever secrets it might be hiding. Now, as I reached the heavy metal door, its surface pitted with rust and salt, the weight of those stories felt heavier. I paused, my hand resting on the cold handle, listening. The only sound was the relentless roar of the sea and the distant cry of gulls. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was stale and thick, tinged with the scent of mildew and old oil. A staircase spiraled upward into darkness, the faint beam of my flashlight slicing through the gloom. Step by step, I ascended, each creak of the wooden stairs echoing like a heartbeat. I kept my eyes focused ahead, but every so often I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to find something watching me. The wind outside seemed to press against the walls, moaning through cracks and broken panes. Somewhere above, the lens of the lighthouse awaited, dusty and forlorn, and used for years. When I reached the top, the lantern room opened before me like a forgotten shrine. The massive Fresnel lens stood in the center, its glass prisms catching the flashlight's beam and casting shards of light across the walls. I ran my fingers over the cold metal railing, marveling at the craftsmanship. The sky beyond was a misty gray, the fog swirling in slow, lazy eddies around the tower. I was about to turn back when a faint noise stopped me. It was subtle at first, just a whisper on the edge of hearing, but it grew steadily clearer, a scraping sound coming from somewhere below. The kind of noise that didn't belong in an empty building. My heart quickened. I told myself it was probably a bird trapped inside or the wind shifting some loose board. But then the noise changed, turning into something like footsteps, soft and deliberate. I gripped the railing, trying to steady my voice. "Hello?" I called out, but the only answer was the echo of my own words. I waited, straining to listen. The footsteps came again, descending the stairs, slow and measured. I couldn't see anyone, but I wasn't entirely alone. I stepped back, my flashlight dancing over the walls as the sound grew louder. A sudden cold draft swept through the room, and the glass panes rattled. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for a rational explanation. Maybe another trespasser had made their way inside, or perhaps, though I hated to admit it, a keeper had returned, living here in secret all these years. The footsteps reached the landing below, and I heard a low, guttural cough. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't human. It had a wet, rasping quality that sent a shiver down my spine. Then, from the darkness beneath the staircase, two dull eyes reflected my flashlight's beam. They watched me. I stumbled backward, terror rooting me in place. The eyes blinked once and vanished. The silence that followed was suffocating. My pulse pounded so loudly I was sure it would betray my position. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen remained dark. No signal, nothing. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the light from the lantern room. I knew I had to get out, to leave this place before whatever was down there decided I wasn't welcome. But the stairs were behind me, and the door was sealed by something unseen. A sudden, sharp knock echoed from the heavy door below. One. Then another. And another. Each strike reverberated through the tower, timed and deliberate. I pressed my back against the cold wall, my breath shallow. "Who's there?" I demanded, voice trembling. No answer. Only the persistent knocking, growing more insistent with each pulse. A sickening realization crept over me. This was no visitor seeking shelter. This was something else. Something that understood the silence of the sea and the loneliness of the lighthouse. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It stretched on, thick and oppressive, until I thought my head might split from the tension. Then a whisper. So faint I barely caught it, like wind over broken glass. "Help me." My blood ran cold. I didn't answer. I didn't want to answer. But I knew then that the lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was a vessel for something trapped, something desperate. And whatever it was watching. Waiting. I was trapped inside with it. The fog had rolled in thick and silent by the time I reached the lighthouse. It smothered the coast in a dull gray haze, swallowing the horizon and muffling the sea's relentless roar. My boots sank slightly into the damp earth with each step, and the salty air clung to my skin, chilled and heavy. I hadn't intended to be out here this late, but I was drawn on by some unshakable knot of unease, a need to understand why the village seemed to dissolve into whispers and shadows whenever the lighthouse's beam cut through the dark. The structure loomed before me, its weathered stone walls scarred by years of relentless storms. The lantern room above was dark, the great lens unlit, a dead eye staring blankly out to sea. I fingered the flashlight in my jacket pocket, its batteries weak but still useful, and pushed open the heavy door. It creaked on rusted hinges, a long sigh that seemed to echo through the hollow tower. Inside, the air was colder, damp with the smell of mold and salt, wrapped in the musty scent of old metal and peeling paint. The spiral staircase hugged the walls tightly, and I began my slow ascent, the beam of my flashlight flickering over rust spots and worn stone. Each step seemed to carry a weight far heavier than its own, as if the structure itself was holding its breath. Halfway up, I stopped, a sudden shift in the air prickling my skin. A faint noise reached me, barely audible over the creaks and groans of the lighthouse, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the slow ticking of a timepiece. It came from somewhere above. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and continued climbing. At the lantern room, the door was ajar. I pushed it open fully and was met with the sight of the massive Fresnel lens, dark and silent, its glass panels smeared with grime. The floor was littered with debris, old ropes, broken glass shards, and a scattering of paper, yellowed and brittle. I crouched down and gathered a few of the sheets, their ink faded but still legible. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. They were logs, maintenance records, but the handwriting was hurried, anxious. The entries stopped abruptly 2 years ago, after a single line, "The light will not stay lit." Something is wrong. I hear voices in the fog. Beneath it, a sudden scrawl, "Do not come here." It watches. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, the rhythm of the tapping now unmistakable, soft but unrelenting, coming from the base of the lighthouse. I hurried down the stairs, heart hammering. At the bottom, the door to the storage room was closed, but I could feel the sound stronger behind it. I pushed the door open with a grunt. The space was cramped and dark, filled with crates and coils of rope. The tapping stopped the moment I entered. Silence fell like a weight. Then, from the corner, a sudden movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of my light. I flicked the beam toward it, but there was nothing there. My breath hitched as I scanned the gloom. Then I saw it, a figure hunched in the corner, pale and still. "Hello?" I called, voice cracking. No answer. I stepped closer, and the scratching resumed, but now it was coming from inside a crate. My instinct screamed at me to run, but something held me there. I pried the crate open, expecting to find some trapped animal, but instead, I found a tangle of old, seaweed-covered clothes and a broken lantern. The tapping stopped again, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whispering that seemed to crawl from the walls themselves. I spun around, flashlight darting wildly, but the room was empty. I stumbled back outside, the fog thickening instantly as I closed the door behind me. The lighthouse stood silent, but the air hummed with something unspoken. I realized then that whatever haunted this place did not belong to any story of ghosts or legends. It was something deeper, older, and anger-rooted in salt and stone. As I turned to leave, the beam from the lighthouse flickered to life, cutting a sharp line through the fog. My heart stopped. I hadn't seen the light switch on. The lantern room was empty. I ran. The beam swept over the jagged cliffs, then swung around in a slow, deliberate circle. It was as if the lighthouse itself was searching for something buried beneath the waves, or perhaps within me. The fog clung to my skin, cold and damp, but beneath that chill, a burning dread grew. I didn't glance back, but I could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back, steady and unblinking. My footsteps splashed through puddles that had formed in the rocky crevices. The path back to the village was a blur of shifting shapes and whispered voices that seemed to ride the wind. They spoke in tongues older than the island, their syllables knotting in my mind like threads tightening around a noose. "Leave," they urged, but I couldn't stop now, not after seeing that light. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled, subtle at first, then a violent shudder. The cliffside cracked, a jagged mouth opening where earth met sea. From the depths, something rose dark and slick, a monstrous shape crowned with seaweed and shells, its eyes glowing faintly like the lighthouse beam. It was not a ghost or man, but a sentinel of the deep, awakened by my trespass. Frozen, I watched as the fog thickened around it, swallowing the light and twisting the night into a suffocating shroud. The lighthouse's beam faltered, sputtered, and died. And then, silence. The cold air inside the lighthouse was sharper than I remembered, slicing through the thin jacket I'd thrown on in a hurry. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The fog still thickened outside, muffling all sound beyond the cracked stone walls. I didn't trust the silence. That silence had swallowed the last 2 nights whole, leaving only the lingering dread behind. I moved up the spiral staircase, my footsteps hollow on the metal steps. The rust and peeling paint were worse than before. The lighthouse felt like it was rotting from the inside out, a corpse that had been left to fester too long. Each step creaked underfoot, and I paused, listening. Nothing but the distant slap of waves, slow and steady against the cliffs. I reached the lantern room at the top. The glass was smeared and streaked with salt and grime, diffusing the weak light from the storm lantern I carried. I set it down on the ledge, the dim orange glow trembling in the thick fog. I needed to see the horizon, to know if the sea was hiding something in the mist. But the glass showed only blank whiteness. I ran my hands over the old brass fixture where the light once revolved, now rusted and immobile. I remembered the nights when it had shone bright, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Now, it was just a relic, a ghost of safety. The feeling came back again then, the oppressive weight in the room, as if unseen eyes were pressing on my skin. I spun around sharply, searching for movement. Shadows shifted in the corners, but nothing solid emerged. My breath caught. That's when I noticed a faint scratching noise, coming from the shaft beside the stairs. I edged closer to the opening, heart thudding painfully in my chest. The shaft was wide enough to admit a man, but it plunged deep into the blackness below. The sound was irregular, like nails tapping on stone, deliberate and slow. I called out, voice low and trembling, "Hello? Is someone down there?" Only silence answered, thick and suffocating. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The lighthouse's bones groaned around me, and the wind held through broken panes, carrying a faint, sickly scent, something like decayed seaweed mixed with smoke. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I needed to understand what had been happening. The strange lights, the unexplainable sounds, the sense that the lighthouse itself was alive and watching. I glanced down at the floor near the shaft and noticed something I hadn't seen before, a series of shallow scratches carved into the stone, like tally marks. 5 of them, neat and deliberate. My fingers traced the marks, and a shiver ran down my spine. Why would someone or something mark the wall here? I looked around again, eyes straining in the dim light. Then I spotted a figure in the corner, a small wooden box, covered in dust and cobwebs. I hesitated but knelt to open it. Inside lay a bundle of old papers, yellowed and brittle. I carefully unfolded the top sheet. It was a diary entry, dated nearly a century ago. I fear the light is failing me. Each night, the shadows grow bolder. I hear whispers in the fog, voices that call my name from the depths. The men say it's my imagination, but I know better. This place is cursed, and the sea demands a sacrifice. My breath hitched. The writer was a lighthouse keeper, long dead. The words felt like a warning etched across time. I flipped through more pages, the handwriting growing more frantic, more fragmented. Tales of strange figures lurking just beyond the rocks, strange lights beneath the water, and a creeping madness that had claimed the men before him. Then, abruptly, the entries stopped. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the lantern flickered. I looked up, heart pounding, and caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. A shadow, large and slow, passing just beyond the fog's reach. I grabbed the lantern and descended the stairs quickly, the scratching sound growing louder behind me. It was no longer irregular, it was scratching with purpose, closer now, following. I burst through the door at the base of the lighthouse and into the storm. Rain stung my face, the wind a roaring beast pressing against my skin. The shadow from before was gone, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I ran towards the keeper's cottage a few yards away, desperate for shelter, for a place to gather my thoughts and catch my breath. Inside, the small room was empty except for a damp cot and a rusted stove. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it. As I caught my breath, the scratching began again, this time on the outside wall, directly against the wood. I pressed my ear to the door. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, like someone or something counting the seconds. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The weight in the room pressed down, heavier than before. The stories from the diary echoed in my mind, the sacrifice, the madness, the light that failed. And then, through the thin walls, I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. Come back to the light. I froze. The voice was soft, almost familiar, but twisted with something ancient and cruel. It wasn't a plea. It was a summons. The scratching stopped. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. I didn't stay in the cottage after that. I sprinted back to the lighthouse, the howling wind tearing at my clothes, the fog swallowing me whole. I needed to see the light, needed to understand if it was still alive in some way, or if it had truly died with the last keeper all those years ago. When I reached the base, I looked up. The lantern room was dark, but for a moment, a faint glow flickered at the top like a dying pulse. Then it vanished. I stood there, shivering in the rain, wondering if the lighthouse was calling me, or warning me away. I wasn't sure which was worse.